The stagecoach hadn't even stopped rolling when the man threw open the door. Wade Holloway didn't wait for the driver. He didn't wait for the dust to settle or for the passengers inside to gather their bearings. He grabbed the frame with one thick hand and hauled himself up onto the step, blocking the light, filling the entire opening with his broad shoulders and the smell of whiskey and cattle money. His eyes found Margaret immediately. Not because she was the only woman on board. There was a younger girl sitting near the window, barely 20, with roses in her cheeks and a carpetbag on her lap. Wade's eyes passed over her completely. They landed on Margaret the way a boot lands on something it intends to grind into the dirt. "You the widow?" he said. Not asked. Said. Margaret didn't answer right away. She had Elliot pressed against her side, his small body warm through her coat, his fingers curled around two of hers. She felt him go very still, the way children go still, when they sense something dangerous has entered the room. "I asked you a question." Wade's voice dropped half a register. The other passengers looked away. The young girl near the window suddenly became very interested in the view outside, which was nothing but frozen mud and the back wall of a livery stable. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said, "and yes, I've come to Silver Creek." Wade looked her over the way a man looks over livestock he's already decided he doesn't want. Slowly, deliberately, making sure she understood exactly what he was doing. "Caleb Dawson sent for you." It wasn't a question either. "He did." Wade made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He let his eyes drop to Elliot, held them there just long enough to make the boy shrink closer to his mother, then looked back up at Margaret with something that might have been pity if it had any warmth in it at all. "You should turn around," he said quietly. "Get back on this coach and go home to wherever you came from. Boston, is it?" He already knew. He'd been waiting for this stage. "You don't belong here, and that boy—" He tilted his chin toward Elliot. "This land doesn't need another mouth that can't earn its keep." Then he stepped down and walked away without looking back, like a man who had just given fair warning and considered his conscience clear. Margaret sat completely still for 3 full seconds. Then she straightened her spine, gathered her bag, took her son's hand, and stepped down into Silver Creek. If you've ever felt like someone decided your worth before you even opened your mouth, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a woman refuses to let that be the end of the sentence. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now. Right now, before this story pulls you in too deep to stop. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because the people who find these videos, they're usually the ones who needed them most. Now, let me tell you about Margaret Whitmore, the woman Silver Creek laughed at, the woman Silver Creek never forgot. She had packed everything she owned into one trunk and one carpet bag. That wasn't poverty, that was choice. Margaret had spent 11 years in a narrow row house on Beacon Hill, surrounded by furniture that belonged to her late husband's family, curtains his mother had chosen, dishes that had never felt like hers. When Robert Whitmore died of a heart seizure on a Wednesday morning in March, just dropped his coffee cup and sat down on the kitchen floor and never got back up. Margaret had grieved him honestly. She had loved him the way you love someone who is kind and steady and present, not wildly, not the kind of love that makes you stupid, but real love, the kind that shows up every day without being asked. What she hadn't expected was what came after. Robert's family had never entirely approved of her. She was a school teacher's daughter from Providence, not from Boston money, and they had tolerated her because Robert wanted her, and Robert was generally impossible to argue with. But Robert was gone now, and the house was technically his mother's, and his mother was a woman who communicated displeasure the way other people breathed, constantly, automatically, without apparent effort. Within 6 months of Robert's death, Margaret understood the situation clearly. The house would be sold. A smaller arrangement would be found. There was a cousin who had a spare room, and wasn't Margaret lucky to have somewhere to go? And of course, Elliot was welcome, though he did run rather loudly for a 6-year-old, didn't he? She had started reading the matrimonial advertisements that winter, not out of desperation, but out of something colder and more useful than desperation. Calculation. She was 35 years old. She had skills. She could read and write and cipher. She could manage a household. She understood basic medicine and animal care from summers spent with her uncle's farm outside Providence. She could sew and preserve and organize and adapt. She was not a girl who needed protecting. She was a woman who needed ground to stand on. Caleb Dawson's advertisement had been brief, straightforward, almost blunt in the way it laid out facts without decoration. Montana rancher, 41, seeks capable woman for marriage and ranch partnership. Hard work expected. Fair treatment guaranteed. Children considered. Children considered. Not children tolerated. Not children accepted with conditions. Considered. Like they were part of the equation instead of a problem to be solved around. She had written to him on a Tuesday evening while Elliot slept, sitting at the narrow writing desk in the corner of the borrowed room, choosing her words with the same care she'd once used grading essays. She told him the truth. Her age. Her widowhood. Her son. Her skills and her limitations. She did not apologize for any of it. His reply came 3 weeks later and was equally plain. Thank you for your honesty. I'll match it. The ranch is isolated and the work is not gentle. Winters here can kill a person who isn't paying attention. I am looking for someone who understands that a life worth building is not the same thing as an easy life. If you understand that and still want to come, I will send the fare. She wrote back the same night. Send the fare. She had not told many people in Boston where she was going. The ones she told made sure she understood exactly what they thought of her decision. Her neighbor, Mrs. Aldrich, had actually touched her arm with what she seemed to believe was compassion and said, Margaret, dear, you do understand how this looks. A mail-order bride, at your age, with the child. The word child delivered as if Elliot were a liability on a balance sheet. Margaret had smiled and said she understood perfectly and thanked Mrs. Aldrich for her concern and then gone home and told Elliot they were going to Montana. Where's Montana? He'd asked. Far, she'd said. Very far. And very big. He'd thought about it for a moment, this quiet, serious boy who looked more like his father every week. The same dark eyes, the same habit of going still before he spoke. Will there be horses? He'd asked. Probably, she'd said. Okay, he'd said, and gone back to his book. That was Elliot. He didn't make things harder than they were. Margaret loved that about him with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her. The journey had taken 11 days. Train to Chicago, train to Billings, then the stagecoach south and west into territory that grew emptier and more enormous with every mile. Elliot had pressed his face against every window with an intensity that was almost scientific, cataloging the landscape with his dark eyes, asking occasional careful questions about the animals he spotted, the towns they passed through, the quality of the light at different hours of the day. By the time they reached the last leg into Silver Creek, Margaret was exhausted in a way that went past her body into something structural, something in the architecture of her resolve. She had held herself together for 11 days through bad food and hard seats, and a night in Billings, where the hotel room had a broken window, and she'd spent 6 hours with Elliot curled against her and her coat spread over both of them, lying awake listening to the wind. She had not let herself wonder too much about Caleb Dawson. She had studied his letters. There had been 4 of them by the time she left Boston. And she'd built a careful, restrained picture. A man who used words economically. A man who didn't embellish. A man who seemed, beneath the plainness of the language, to have a certain quietness in him that she respected without knowing why. She had not let herself hope too hard. Hoping too hard was how you broke yourself against outcomes you couldn't control. Then Wade Holloway had climbed into the stagecoach, looked at her son like he was a problem, told her to go home, and walked away. And Margaret had stepped down into Silver Creek with her back straight and her heart hammering and Elliot's hand in hers, and thought, all right then, now I know what kind of place this is going to be. The first person to be genuinely kind to her was the woman who ran the dry goods store. Her name was Ruth Hadley, and she was somewhere between 50 and eternity, with the kind of face that had made peace with every hard thing it had seen and come out the other side with laugh lines instead of bitterness. She spotted Margaret and Elliot standing outside the stage office with their bags, looking at the street with the expression of people who know they've arrived but aren't yet sure what that means, and she crossed the road without any particular ceremony and said, You must be Caleb's intended. I'm Ruth. Come inside before you freeze. Boy, do you like gingerbread? Elliot looked at his mother. It's all right, Margaret said. Yes, please, Elliot said with the careful politeness of a child who had been taught that manners were armor. Inside the store, While Elliot sat at the small counter with a piece of gingerbread and the focused contentment of a 6-year-old encountering something excellent, Ruth put a cup of coffee in Margaret's hands and looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen too much to bother with pretense. "Wade got to you already," she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret looked at her steadily. "He introduced himself, yes." Ruth made a sound that managed to be both sympathetic and dismissive at the same time. "Don't take it personally. He does that to anything that might strengthen Caleb's position. The Dawson land is the best grazing land in this valley, and Wade has wanted it for 12 years. She took a sip of her own coffee. "You're not what he expected." "What did he expect?" Ruth smiled. It moved around the edges of her eyes first. "Someone easier to scare, I suppose." Before Margaret could respond, the door opened. She knew it was him before she turned around. She couldn't have explained how. Some change in the quality of the room, maybe. Or the way Ruth's posture shifted slightly. Not with fear, but with the small adjustment of someone who knows the person who just arrived matters. Caleb Dawson was taller than she'd pictured, and somewhere in the neighborhood of ordinary looking, which she appreciated. She had been half afraid he'd be either remarkably handsome, which would have made her self-conscious, or remarkably difficult to look at, which would have made everything harder. He was neither. He was a man who looked like he spent most of his time outdoors doing physical work, with a face weathered enough to show it and hands to match. He had Elliot's same tendency toward stillness before speaking. She noticed that immediately. He noticed her noticing. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dawson." A beat of silence. Not uncomfortable, just two people taking accurate stock of each other. Then he looked past her at Elliot, who had stopped eating his gingerbread and was watching Caleb with the solemn attention of a child trying to decide what to feel. "This is Elliot," Margaret said. Caleb crouched down, actually crouched, so he was at the boy's level instead of towering over him, and said, "You had a long trip." 11 days, Elliot said seriously. "We saw a buffalo, just one, far away." "You'll see more," Caleb said. "If you want, I'll take you out sometime when the weather's right, and we'll find you a whole herd." Elliot looked at his mother. She saw in his face the thing she'd been watching for since the stagecoach. The question of whether this was a person who could be trusted, asked without words. She gave him the smallest nod. "Okay," Elliot said. Caleb stood back up. He looked at Margaret and said quietly, without apparent concern for whether Ruth could hear, "I heard Wade was at the stage. I'm sorry I wasn't there." "You're not responsible for what other men do," Margaret said. "No," he agreed, "but I'm responsible for what comes next." She thought about that for a long moment. It was the most information she'd received about his character in the 17 seconds she'd known him in person, and it told her more than 4 letters had. "Then we'd better get started," she said. "What?" The ride out to the ranch took most of the afternoon. Caleb had a wagon, a solid dun horse named Fletcher, and a way of driving that suggested he'd done it so many times, his hands worked independent of his conscious attention. He and Margaret talked the way two careful people talk, when they're both trying to get the important information across without making the other person feel interrogated. He told her about the ranch, the size of it, the state of the herd, the 2 ranch hands he employed seasonally, and the one who stayed year-round, a man named Arlo, who was, by Caleb's accounting, reliable and taciturn, and possibly part mountain goat based on his ability to navigate the winter terrain. Margaret told him about her practical skills, and tried to be precise about it. She didn't list them like accomplishments. She listed them the way you tell a new employer what you can actually do, with an honesty about limits included. "I know enough medicine to deal with most injuries and some illness," she said. "I've set a broken finger, treated a burn, managed a bad fever. I don't know what to do with a gunshot wound." "Hopefully that won't come up," Caleb said. "Hopefully. I can manage accounts if you need it. I'm better at arithmetic than most people give me credit for." He glanced at her briefly. "Most people don't give you much credit for anything. Is that what you're telling me?" She thought about Mrs. Aldrich. About the cousins who'd smiled and called Elliot lively when they meant loud. About the matrimonial advertisement that 3 different people in Boston had implied she was too old and too encumbered to answer. "Something like that," she said. Caleb turned his eyes back to the road. "Folks who haven't had to work that hard often mistake hard work for failure," he said. "I've noticed that." It was not a profound statement. He delivered it like an observation rather than a philosophy. But Margaret turned it over in her mind and found it accurate and strangely comforting. Elliot had fallen asleep between them by the time they were an hour out of town, his head listing gradually toward Margaret's arm until she adjusted and let him lean against her. Caleb looked at the sleeping boy and then looked back at the road and didn't say anything, but there was nothing in his expression that suggested the sight bothered him. That mattered to Margaret more than he would ever know. The ranch appeared out of the early darkness, like something that had grown from the land rather than been built on it. It was larger than she'd expected, a main house with real glass windows, a substantial barn, several outbuildings, fencing that stretched out until it disappeared into the dark. It looked weathered and functional and genuinely used. It looked like a place where real life happened. The man waiting by the barn was Arlo. She gathered this before introductions, because he was exactly what Caleb's description had suggested. Somewhere north of 60, with a face like old leather, and the posture of a man who had decided a long time ago that most words were unnecessary. He looked at Margaret with an expression that was not welcoming, but was also not hostile. Assessment without verdict. "Settled in the East Room," he said to Caleb. "Thank you," Caleb said. Arlo looked at Elliot, now awake and blinking sleepily in Margaret's arms, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face. It might have been recognition of something. Margaret couldn't have named what. "Room next to it's got a cot," he said. "For the boy." "Thank you," Margaret said. He nodded once and went back into the barn. Wow. The first 2 weeks were harder than Margaret had prepared herself for, and she had prepared herself for quite a lot. The work was not the problem. She had expected the work, and the work was simply work. Enormous in quantity, often cold, frequently frustrating in the way all physical labor is frustrating when your body is still adjusting to its demands. She threw herself at it without self-consciousness. She got up before light, she learned the rhythms of the ranch as fast as she could absorb them. She made mistakes and acknowledged them plainly and corrected them and moved forward. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the toll of constant visibility. Every 2 or 3 days they had reason to go into Silver Creek, and every time they went, the town watched. She could feel it, not always overtly, not always cruelly, but watchfully, the way a community watches something it isn't sure about yet. Women who probably would have been neighborly under other circumstances held themselves at slight remove. Men who spoke easily to Caleb said little to her. The deacon's wife, a woman named Patricia Greer, whose opinion apparently carried the weight of civic verdict in Silver Creek, had looked Margaret over in the general store one morning with an expression of polite doubt and said, "I do hope you find the frontier suits you, Mrs. Whitmore. Not everyone takes to it." The implication was clear. Not everyone in this sentence meant Margaret specifically. She had smiled and said, "I find that things suit you or they don't, and the best way to find out is to try." And Patricia Greer had made the same sound Wade Holloway had made on the stagecoach, that particular non-laugh that meant "we'll see," and turned back to her shopping. It was Elliot who suffered more visibly. The other children in Silver Creek had the casual cruelty of children who are parroting adults without understanding what the words mean. A boy of about 8 named Douglas Greer, Patricia's son, Margaret discovered without much surprise, had informed Elliot on his 3rd day that nobody wanted a mail-order bride's leftover kid, and that Elliot's father had probably died on purpose to get away. Elliot had not cried. That was almost worse. He'd come home from the afternoon Caleb had taken him to pick up supplies, and he'd been quiet in a different way than his usual quiet, compressed, like something had been pushed down hard. Margaret had coaxed it out of him eventually, sitting on the edge of his cot in the small room that was becoming, slowly, his. She held herself together while he told her. She had become expert at that. The internal split, the part of her that wanted to break apart, held firmly behind the part that her son needed to see stay whole. "What Douglas said isn't true," she said when he finished. "I know," Elliot said. "Your father loved you more than—" "I know, Mom." He said it quietly, without impatience, but with a certainty that told her he had already processed this more than she realized. "I know it's true. I just don't like that he said it." "I know." "Is it always going to be like this?" She looked at him, his dark eyes, so serious, so young. She thought about lying, the comfortable lie that things would get easier soon, that people would come around quickly, that Silver Creek would be kind once it knew them better. She thought about how much she hated being lied to and remembered that Elliot hated it too, had hated it since he was 3 years old, with an accuracy that was sometimes unnerving. Probably not always, she said. But for a while, maybe, people take time to change their minds. Why? Because changing your mind feels like admitting you were wrong, and a lot of people would rather be wrong for the rest of their lives than admit it once. He considered this with the particular gravity of a 6-year-old encountering an uncomfortable fact about human nature. That's pretty stupid, he finally said. Yes, she agreed. It is. Caleb found out about Douglas Greer's comment 3 days later. Margaret didn't tell him. Arlo did, apparently, in the way Arlo communicated most things, with about 14 words and an expression that conveyed the rest. She didn't know what Caleb said to whoever he needed to say it to. She didn't ask. What she noticed was that the next time they went into Silver Creek, Patricia Greer crossed the street to speak to her without being prompted. And while the conversation was stiff and brief, the effort was real. And Douglas Greer, when he encountered Elliot near the livery stable, looked at the ground and said nothing at all. It was not resolution, it was a ceasefire. But it was something. What was changing faster, and with less visible effort, was the relationship between Elliot and Caleb. She watched it happen in pieces, the way a wary animal extends its trust, incrementally, with frequent retreat, in stages so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. Caleb had started taking Elliot to the barn in the mornings. Not formally, not with any stated purpose, just the door would open, and he'd say, "Coming?" in the same tone he'd used talking to Arlo, and Elliot would slide off his chair and pull on his coat and go. They'd be gone an hour, sometimes more. Margaret learned not to watch for them from the window. She learned to let that hour be its own thing. Once, coming into the barn for a different reason, she'd stopped in the doorway and seen them, Caleb with his hands guiding Elliot's on a piece of harness he was mending, talking quietly about how the leather worked, why it failed where it did, how you felt for the weak point before it snapped. Elliot was listening with the same focused attention he gave to things he genuinely cared about, not the polite half-attention he used when he was tolerating something. His whole body was forward. She backed out of the doorway before either of them saw her. She stood in the cold outside the barn and held herself together with both hands. Then she went back to the house and got on with the work. The letter from Wade Holloway arrived on a Friday, which would later seem to her like a thing that could not be coincidence. Fridays being the end of the working week, the moment when a family's guard drops. It was addressed to Caleb, but delivered when Caleb was out on the range. Arlo set it on the table without comment. Margaret didn't open it. When Caleb came in that evening, he read it without expression. Then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. He's claiming a portion of the North Pasture should have reverted to his land after the flood survey 2 years ago, Caleb said. He has a surveyor prepared to testify. Is the claim legitimate? Margaret asked. No. Can you prove that? I have the original survey documents, but Wade has money and a lawyer from Billings, and apparently 3 witnesses who are prepared to say whatever he needs them to say. He was very still, the way she'd come to recognize as him thinking rather than shutting down. The land judge comes through Silver Creek in March. It was November. 4 months, she said. 4 months. He looked at her. He's been after that pasture for a long time. The North Pasture feeds almost a third of the herd in the summer. Without it, he stopped. She waited. Without it, he said, the ranch works. But it doesn't grow, and in 5 years it probably doesn't survive. She looked at the letter on the table. She thought about Elliot saying okay when she'd told him they were going to Montana. She thought about 11 days on the road, the broken window in Billings, the cold. She thought about Wade Holloway on the stagecoach step, his eyes passing over her son like he was nothing. Then we fight it, she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Not with surprise exactly, more like a man who had said something to himself privately and was now hearing it confirmed from outside. It'll get worse before it's resolved, he said. Wade doesn't do things part way. I know. And I don't... He paused, started again. I want to be honest with you. I don't have a lot of experience with this, fighting someone in court. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to work cattle and read weather and fix fence. I don't know how to outmaneuver a man with a Billings lawyer and 3 paid witnesses. He said it plainly, without apology, the way she'd listed her own limits on the wagon ride from town. She recognized the grammar of it. This is what I have, and this is what I don't have, and here it is, straight. I can read, she said, and I can organize information, and I can think clearly when I'm frightened, which most people can't. She looked at him. And I'm very frightened right now, so that might actually be useful. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't quite humor, it wasn't quite admiration. It was something in between, or something else entirely. All right, he said. She reached across the table and picked up the letter and started reading it properly, from the beginning, noting every claim and every name and every date. Outside, the first real cold of what would become a brutal winter began to settle over the valley, pressing down on the ranch, on the north pasture, on the ground they had decided, together and without ceremony, to refuse to give up. She read until the lamp needed trimming. Then she trimmed it and kept reading. She read through Wade Holloway's letter 3 times before she trusted herself to have an opinion about it. The first time she read it for content, what it claimed, what it cited, what names appeared, and in what order. The second time she read it for gaps, what it carefully didn't say, where the language softened or grew vague, the places where precision would have been inconvenient, and so precision was absent. The third time she read it slowly, the way she'd once read student essays looking for the seam between what someone understood and what they were pretending to understand. By the end of the third reading, she had a list of questions written in the margin of an old supply ledger she'd borrowed from the shelf beside the kitchen window. Caleb had watched her do this without comment. He'd made coffee at some point and set a cup beside her without interrupting. That small act, the coffee appearing without request, without remark, told her something she filed away without examining too closely yet. The flood survey, she said when she finally looked up. Who conducted it? Man named Prescott. He's out of Billings, works for the territory. Is he the same man Wade is citing as his surveyor? Caleb's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't caught that. She watched him realize he hadn't caught it. I don't know, he said. Find out. She turned back to the ledger. If it's the same man, that's a problem for Wade's argument, not yours. A surveyor can't conduct an independent review of his own prior work and present it as new evidence. That's not how it's supposed to function. You know land law? I know how argument works, she said. The structure is usually the same regardless of subject. She looked at the list she'd made. You said you have the original survey documents in the chest in the office, under the deed. I need to look at them tonight. He got up without being asked and went to get them. That was how it started. Not with any declaration, not with a moment that announced itself as significant, but with a lamp on a kitchen table, and a woman who read carefully, and a man who had the sense to recognize useful when he saw it and get out of its way. The original survey documents were a mess, not fraudulent. She could see they were genuine, the kind of paperwork generated by people who were thorough but not organized, who recorded everything and filed nothing with any logical system. There were 3 separate surveys across a 15-year period, each referencing landmarks that had shifted or disappeared, measurements taken in different seasons with different instruments, and a notation in the most recent document that referred back to a boundary marker that didn't appear in either of the previous 2. Margaret spread them across the kitchen table in chronological order and weighted the corners with coffee cups and a flat iron and spent the better part of 2 evenings reconstructing a coherent picture of what they actually established. Caleb sat with her the second evening, not because she needed him to, but because she'd begun asking questions that required him to answer. What was the state of the creek in the spring of 1879? Where had the old fence line run before the 81 repair? What did the flood actually take, and what had they rebuilt, and where? He answered in the precise, factual way she was coming to expect from him, and she wrote the answers down in the margins of her ledger in her small, dense handwriting. You write fast, he observed. I used to take dictation for my father's correspondence. He talked faster than most people could follow. She didn't look up from the page. He was a school teacher. He believed in being efficient with words because he believed words were worth something. What happened to him? He died when I was 22. Pneumonia. She finished the notation and looked up. He would have liked Montana, I think. He liked things that were too big to summarize. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. The boundary marker in the 83 survey, he said. It was an old cottonwood that had been there since before my father bought the land. The flood in 81 didn't take it, but it damaged the roots. It fell 2 winters later. Is there any record of where it stood? Any other document that references it? He thought. There might be something in my father's correspondence with the land office. He wrote to them when he first filed the deed. I have his papers in the chest. I never went through all of them. She looked at him. Get the chest. He went and got the chest. They were up until past midnight that night. Arlo came in from the barn at some point, looked at the table covered in papers and cups and the lamp burning low, said nothing, refilled the coffee pot and went to bed. Margaret made a mental note to find some way to thank him for that. The wordless, practical support of a person who understood when help meant staying out of the way. What they found in the second layer of Caleb's father's papers was a letter from the land office dated 1869, referencing the cottonwood by name and describing its position in relation to the creek with a precision that the later surveys lacked. Someone in the land office had cared enough in 1869 to be specific, and that specificity, 16 years later, was the difference between a claim that might hold up and one that almost certainly would not. Margaret sat back in her chair and looked at the letter. "This is what you need," she said. Caleb leaned over and read it. He read it twice. Then he sat back too, and she saw something in his face release. Not completely, because the legal fight was still 4 months away, and Wade Holloway still had a lawyer from Billings, and everything could still go wrong. But something. "I wouldn't have found that," he said quietly. "I've had that chest for 3 years since my father died. I never went all the way through it." "You were running a ranch." Still. She looked at the letter in her hand and the mess of documents on the table and felt, suddenly, the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from sustained mental effort over a period of time. Her eyes hurt. Her shoulders ached. Outside the window, the temperature had dropped again, and she could hear the wind picking up. "We should sleep," she said. "Yeah." He didn't move immediately. He was looking at the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read in the lamplight. "Margaret." He said her name the way he said most things, plainly, without theater, but not carelessly either. "I want to say something, and I'm not sure I'll say it right." She waited. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said, "I thought I knew what I needed. Someone capable, someone who understood hard work. I thought I was being practical." He paused. "I don't think I understood what I was actually asking for." She looked at him carefully. "What were you asking for?" "I don't know exactly." He said it with the discomfort of a man who was not accustomed to this kind of conversation and was making the effort anyway, which she found more credible than ease would have been. "Someone who saw the same things as me, maybe. Someone who understood that a place can be worth fighting for even when everything's against it." He looked at her. "I think I was asking for a partner and I just didn't have the word for it." She held that for a moment. The wind pushed at the window. The lamp flickered. "That's not a bad thing to ask for," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She gathered the documents carefully and organized them back into the order she'd established. "We should make a copy of the 1869 letter," she said. "Before anything else. Keep the original in the chest and the copy somewhere separate." "I'll do it tomorrow morning," he said. "Good night, Mr. Dawson." "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." She took the lamp and went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the wind and felt not happy exactly, because the situation was too precarious for happiness, but something adjacent to it, oriented, like a compass needle that had been spinning and finally found north. December arrived with the violence that Silver Creek's old-timers would later describe as the worst opening week of winter in a decade and a half. It didn't snow at first. It just turned cold, the kind of cold that has weight to it, that presses down on everything, that makes the air feel brittle. The cattle moved differently in that cold, clustering tighter, heads down, burning calories faster than the hay could replace them. Caleb watched the sky with the expression of a man reading a text he already knew wouldn't end well. Margaret watched Caleb watch the sky and learned what to look for. She was good at this, at learning through observation rather than instruction, at picking up the grammar of a place or a person by paying attention without announcing she was doing it. Within 3 weeks of arriving at the ranch, she had understood the daily rhythms well enough that she anticipated needs before they were stated. She knew that Arlo's back troubled him in the cold, and that he would never say so, and she began leaving the kettle on the back of the stove so there was always hot water available without the effort of building the temperature back up. She knew that Caleb checked the east fence line first thing after any wind event, Not because it was the most vulnerable, but because his father had lost cattle through a gap in the east fence in the winter of '74, and the habit had calcified into something he didn't examine. She knew that Fletcher, the dun horse, was particular about being approached from the left on cold mornings, and she taught Elliot this without making it a formal lesson. Just mentioned it once, in passing, while they were walking to the barn together, and watched him absorb it the way he absorbed everything. Elliot was absorbing a great deal. There was a transformation happening in her son that she could see clearly precisely because she was his mother, and mothers carry a running internal portrait of their children updated in real time. The boy who had boarded the stagecoach in Boston 11 days before her arrival in Silver Creek, compressed and careful and watchful in the way children are watchful when they aren't sure they're wanted, was not the same as the boy who now came to breakfast with hay in his hair and a report on which of the horses had eaten their full ration and which had been picky about it. He talked more, not excessively. Elliot would never be a chatterbox, but with the confidence of someone who had discovered that what he noticed and what he thought about what he noticed were things worth saying aloud. Caleb listened to him. Really listened, in the way that is rarer than it should be, not waiting for the child to finish so the adult could respond, but actually tracking what was being said and engaging with it directly. He'd correct Elliot when Elliot was wrong about something, and he'd do it without softening it into mush. That's not quite right, here's why, and then explain the actual thing, and then ask if it made sense, and wait for Elliot to say whether it did or didn't. Elliot had never had that from an adult outside his mother. Margaret watched it happening and felt the complicated mix of gratitude and grief and something like hope that makes up the particular emotional weather of a parent watching their child being repaired after damage. Wade Holloway's first real move came on a Wednesday, 8 days into December, and it didn't come through a lawyer. It came through a woman named Clara Sims, who was the wife of one of Silver Creek's 2 doctors, and who had appointed herself the unofficial social arbiter of the community's female population. Clara Sims arrived at the ranch in the mid-morning in a buggy driven by a hired man, wearing a coat that had cost more than most families in Silver Creek saw in a month, carrying a tin of biscuits that she offered as though they were a peace treaty, and a face arranged into an expression of warm concern that Margaret identified immediately as working. She was not fooled by Clara Sims, but she let her in, offered her coffee, and sat across the kitchen table from her with her hands folded and her expression politely receptive, which was a skill she'd developed over 11 years of managing social situations she hadn't chosen to be in. Clara Sims talked for 20 minutes about the challenges of frontier life for women who weren't accustomed to it. She talked about the isolation and the harsh winters and the particular difficulty of managing a household so far from town. She mentioned gently that some women who had come out to the frontier under similar circumstances had found it not at all what they'd hoped. She mentioned, even more gently, that Silver Creek had a small but lovely boarding house run by a Mrs. Patterson who had 2 spare rooms and who was always glad to help women in transition. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "That's very kind, Mrs. Sims. Did Wade Holloway suggest you come out here, or was it your own idea?" The pause was brief. Clara Sims was good at this. She recovered fast, smoothed her expression back into warm concern before the break had lasted more than a second. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I think you do," Margaret said pleasantly. "And I think you're not a cruel woman. I think you've been told a version of this situation that made helping him seem like helping me, and I think if you knew the full version, you'd be uncomfortable." She poured more coffee into Clara's cup without asking. "Wade Holloway wants this ranch. He's wanted it for 12 years. He has a legal claim pending that doesn't hold up against the original documentation, and he's running out of ways to apply pressure, so he's trying social pressure now, through you." She looked at Clara steadily. "You're being used, Mrs. Sims. I thought you should know that, woman to woman." Another pause, longer this time. Clara Sims looked at her coffee. She looked at the kitchen, at the organized shelves, the clean table, the supply ledger on the counter with its dense handwritten notes, the small coat hanging by the door that belonged to a 6-year-old boy who was currently in the barn learning how to care for something. Whatever she was looking for or measuring, she found it or found enough of it. "He told me you wouldn't last the winter," she said finally. Not warmly. This wasn't a conversion into friendship, but honestly. "He may be right," Margaret said, "but not for the reasons he thinks." Clara Sims left 45 minutes later with a different expression on her face than the one she'd arrived with. She didn't become an ally. Margaret wasn't naive enough to expect that. But she didn't come back on Wade's behalf either, which was the realistic best outcome, and Margaret took it. She told Caleb that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his consistent approach to being told things. Then he said, Clara Sims hasn't done a favor for anyone she didn't also do for herself. The fact that she left without saying her piece out loud means she's keeping her options open. That's fine, Margaret said. I don't need her to be on our side. I just need her to not be actively on his. Caleb looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something he agreed with but hadn't found the words for. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Think about people that way. Accurately, but not bitterly. She considered this. I've had a lot of practice, she said, being underestimated. After a while, you stop being angry about it and start using it. People tell you exactly who they are and what they want if you just let them talk long enough. She paused. Wade Holloway told me everything I needed to know in the first 30 seconds on that stagecoach. What did he tell you? That he's afraid. She said it simply. Afraid men make threats. Men who are actually dangerous are usually quiet about it until the moment they aren't. Caleb was quiet for a moment. So when does he stop being just afraid? When he realizes the threats aren't working. She met his eyes. Which means we should expect something else. Soon. The something else came 9 days before Christmas, and it came in the form of a job offer, not to Caleb, to Arlo. A writer came out from Silver Creek with a letter from Wade Holloway's operation, addressed to Arlo Pruitt by name. The letter offered him twice his current wage to come work for the Holloway outfit starting the 1st of January. It mentioned, with the particular precision of a threat that doesn't use threat words, that Dawson Ranch's future in the valley was uncertain and that Arlo might want to consider his own security. Arlo read the letter standing in the barn doorway, his face doing approximately nothing. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket, walked into the house, set it on the kitchen table in front of Caleb, and said, "No." Then he walked back out to the barn. Caleb looked at the letter. He looked at the door Arlo had gone through. He's been with this ranch for 19 years, he said, not really to Margaret, more to the fact of it. I know, she said. He worked for my father before me. Wade knows that. Which is why he tried, she said, because losing Arlo would have hurt you more than almost anything else he could do short of direct action. He's testing what's available to him. Caleb pushed the letter aside. The gesture had a finality in it. What's he going to try next? If you had to guess. She thought about it seriously because he was asking seriously. He's tried legal pressure and social pressure and trying to pull your people away. The thing he hasn't tried is something that looks like an accident. She watched his face. Your cattle, your fences, something that can't be directly traced to him. She saw the acknowledgement move through him. Not surprised because he'd probably already thought it, but the sober recognition of hearing it said plainly. I'll talk to Arlo, he said, about the fence checks. More frequent. And the watering points, she said. If the water sources are fouled or blocked, the herd suffers even if nothing structural is touched. He nodded slowly. He was already reorganizing in his head. She could see it, the mental rearrangement of priorities, the assessment of vulnerabilities. She recognized this process because she did it herself and had done it her whole adult life, in different arenas, with different stakes. I should have done this already, he said. You didn't have reason to think it would escalate this fast, she said. I've known Wade Holloway for 12 years. I should have known. She let that sit. He was right, and she wasn't going to take that away from him by disagreeing with it. Sometimes people needed to look clearly at where they'd underestimated a situation. Taking that clarity away was not kindness. You know now, she said. Christmas at Dawson Ranch was not a large occasion. Ruth Hadley came out from Silver Creek on Christmas Eve with a basket and the company of her hired girl, a young Crow woman named Adeline, who said almost nothing but moved through the kitchen with an efficiency that Margaret admired immediately. Ruth brought preserved plums and a cured ham and 3 jars of something she called her mother's apple butter, and which was, by honest assessment, the best thing Margaret had eaten since Boston. They had a quiet dinner. Caleb, Margaret, Elliot, Arlo, Ruth, Adeline. 6 people around a table that could have seated 12, which gave it the feeling not of a sparse gathering, but of people who had deliberately chosen to be in the same room. Arlo sat beside Ruth with the ease of long familiarity, and at some point Margaret realized they had known each other for decades, and that the ease between them had a history she wasn't privy to and didn't need to be. Elliot sat beside Caleb and explained to him, with complete seriousness, that he had observed that the bay mare Caleb called Belle was likely to foal earlier than Caleb expected based on behavioral changes he had noticed over the past week. Caleb listened to this. Then he asked 3 specific questions about what changes Elliot had observed, and Elliot answered them with the same focused precision he brought to everything he cared about. "I think you're right," Caleb said. "I'll watch her more closely." Ruth caught Margaret's eye across the table. Something passed between them. The particular understanding of women who recognize something important being built in front of them and know better than to call attention to it. After dinner, after Ruth and Adeline had gone, and Arlo had retreated to his quarters and Elliot had fallen asleep on the settee with his head on a folded blanket and his face finally unguarded in sleep the way children's faces become, Margaret and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them and neither of them in any hurry to end the evening. "He's going to be all right," Caleb said, looking at Elliot through the doorway. She didn't have to ask who he meant. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was tired of carrying true things alone, "I was scared for him. When we were still in Boston, not about this specifically, but about the shape of his life, whether there would be room for him." "There's room," Caleb said. No qualification, no elaboration, just the plain statement of a fact he'd apparently already decided. She looked at him. The lamplight made his face older and also somehow more readable. "Why did you wait so long to send for someone?" she asked. "You're 41. The ranch has been yours for 3 years. Most men in my position weren't paying attention to whether they actually wanted company or whether they just thought they should," he said. "Took me a while to tell the difference." He looked into his cup. "My father's marriage wasn't good. Not violent or anything like that. Just 2 people who were wrong for each other and stayed out of stubbornness. I watched that for 20 years and I thought, I'd rather be alone than repeat that." "What changed your mind?" He looked at her. "I got tired of practical," he said. "I ran everything. I managed everything. Arlo's good, but there's a difference between running something well and building something worth running." He paused. "I wanted someone to build it with." The fire in the stove had burned down to coals that ticked quietly in the silence. She thought about Robert, who had been kind and steady and present, and whom she had loved genuinely. She thought about the row house in Boston, and the furniture that wasn't hers, and the cousin's spare room, and Mrs. Aldrich's pitying hand on her arm. She thought about 11 days on a train with a 6-year-old and a broken window in Billings and Wade Holloway on the stagecoach step. She thought about how this kitchen felt like the first room she'd been in for years, where she didn't have to calculate whether she was welcome. "I think," she said carefully, "that I understand what you mean." He nodded. Not as a response to the words exactly, more as the acknowledgement that something had been said that didn't need adding to. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving around the eaves of the house with the particular insistence that meant tomorrow would be bad. The cattle would need checking at first light. The east fence would need a walk. There was a split in the barn door she'd noticed 3 days ago and mentioned to Arlo and hadn't followed up on and should. There was always more. That was the truth of a place like this. The list of what needed doing never emptied. It just changed what was at the top. But for the first time since she'd stepped down from the stagecoach into Silver Creek's judgment and cold and complicated geography, the list didn't feel like a threat. It felt like evidence of something worth maintaining. She finished her coffee, cold as it was. "First light," she said. "First light," he agreed. She went to gather Elliot from the settee and carry him to his cot, and she felt the weight of him in her arms. Heavier than he'd been in Boston. She could swear it, though it had only been weeks. And she thought, this is what it feels like when things start, not when things end. And she held on to that the way you hold on to the edge of something solid when the ground beneath you is still uncertain. The wind pushed at the house. She kept walking. The wind she'd heard pushing at the eaves that Christmas night turned out to be the opening note of something much larger. By the second week of January, Silver Creek's old-timers had stopped making predictions about the weather because every prediction they made came out wrong on the side of being too optimistic. The cold didn't break the way it usually broke, with a brief warm spell in the middle of January that gave cattle and people alike a chance to recover before the second push. It just stayed and deepened, and the sky had the particular flat gray color that Caleb said meant it wasn't done yet. Margaret had learned to read the sky. She hadn't set out to learn it. It had accumulated the way most useful knowledge accumulates, through proximity and repetition and necessity. She knew now that the low ceiling with no visible texture meant dry cold. She knew that the streaked clouds moving fast from the northwest meant wind before snow. She knew that the particular stillness that sometimes settled over the valley in the early morning, when even the cattle stood without moving and the air felt held, meant that something was building in the mountains that hadn't reached them yet. She was standing in that kind of stillness on the morning of January 14th when Arlo came around the side of the barn, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move. Arlo moved through life at the pace of a man who had decided a long time ago that urgency was mostly theater. When he was moving fast, something was actually wrong. "East fence," he said when he reached her. "Third section." She didn't ask questions. She went to find Caleb. The third section of the east fence was where the property line ran along a shallow draw that filled with snowmelt in spring and sat mostly dry the rest of the year. It was the section she'd noted 3 weeks ago as the most vulnerable. The posts were older there, set by Caleb's father in ground that had more rock than soil, and 2 of them had been leaning at an angle that wasn't quite alarming, but was the kind of thing you watched. Someone had helped them along. That was the word Caleb used when he crouched down and looked at the base of the first post, at the way the ground had been disturbed around it in a pattern that wasn't consistent with frost heave or animal interference. "Helped." He said it in a flat voice that was not the voice he used when he was angry. It was quieter than that, quiet in the way that meant he was deciding something. "How much of the herd came through?" Margaret asked. "Arlo's counting," Caleb said. He stood up and looked at the gap in the fence line. The broken section was about 40 feet wide enough for cattle to move through freely, which they had. The tracks going through were numerous, spread out, going in several different directions on the other side. The snow beyond the fence line was churned up and then farther out, smoothed by wind into a surface that didn't distinguish one trail from another. "They didn't go on their own," she said. He looked at her. "Cattle don't spread out like that from a break," she said. "They move together. These tracks go in 3 or 4 different directions from the first 50 feet. Something moved them. Or someone." He crouched again and looked at the tracks she was looking at. She watched him see what she was seeing. The divergence too early, too deliberate, the way a practiced eye could read a story in compressed snow if it knew what narrative to look for. "How do you know that?" he asked. "I don't, entirely," she said. "But it's consistent with what you predicted about Wade's next move. Something that looks like an accident." She looked out at the empty range beyond the fence. "The question is where they went and how far." Arlo came back before Caleb could answer. He'd counted what he could see from the barn and the near pasture. The number he gave made Caleb's jaw tighten. 63 head, out of a herd of 212. Nearly a third of the cattle gone into the frozen range. Caleb's first instinct was to go alone. She saw it in the way he turned toward the barn before anyone had spoken another word. The automatic solo movement of a man who had solved every problem on this ranch by himself for 3 years before she arrived, who carried the default setting of solitude the way some people carry posture. "I'm coming," she said. He turned. "It's going to be bad out there. Temperature's dropping and the wind." "I know what the temperature is," she said. "I've been living here for 2 months. I'm coming." "Elliot?" "Arlo will stay with him." She looked at Arlo, who was already nodding without being asked. "He knows. And Elliot is not a child who panics." She met Caleb's eyes. "You need someone who can think if you're occupied with managing the horses or the cattle. One person trying to do all of that alone is how people die out here." He held her gaze for a moment. She watched him work through it, not the chauvinism of a man who thought she couldn't do it, which would have been simple to push against. Something more complicated. He didn't want her in danger. That was its own thing, and it was recent, and it was real, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't know it. "I understand the risk," she said more quietly. "I'm choosing to take it. That's my choice to make." Another moment. Then he said, Dress for worse than it looks. She dressed for worse than it looked. Before she went to the barn, she stopped in the doorway of the kitchen where Elliot was eating his breakfast, and she crouched down to his level, the way Caleb had done on the day they arrived, she realized. And she looked at him squarely. Caleb and I need to go find some cattle that got out, she said. Arlo's going to be here with you. I need you to listen to him and not give him any trouble and not go past the barn. Elliot looked at her with those dark, serious eyes. How long? I don't know. Most of the day, probably. He thought about it. Are you going to be okay? She didn't hesitate. Yes. We're going to be careful. She put her hand briefly on his face, and he let her. He was at the age where he was starting to be self-conscious about that kind of thing, which broke her heart a little every time she noticed it. You're in charge of the house. Understood? Something settled in his expression. Not relief exactly, more like the particular calm that Elliot found in being given a clear responsibility. Understood, he said. She went to the barn. They rode out in the mid-morning with the cold sitting on everything like a physical weight. Margaret was on a steady gray mare named Vera that Caleb had given her to use in the weeks after arriving. Not the most responsive horse in the barn, he'd said with an apology, but the most reliable in bad weather. And in Margaret's assessment, a few weeks of riding her had confirmed that reliable was underrated. Vera went where she was pointed and maintained her pace through conditions that made some of the younger horses skittish, and right now that was worth more than speed. They took the draw east and then north, following the most logical path the cattle would have taken based on the direction the tracks diverged. The wind was steady from the northwest, and the cold had a quality she hadn't encountered even in the worst of the previous weeks. It wasn't sharp, it was heavy, the kind of cold that doesn't bite so much as press in from all sides and work on your warmth reserves methodically. She kept track of landmarks. She had started doing this the third week after arriving, building a mental map of the territory around the ranch, noting the features that would remain identifiable under snow, the rock formations and tree lines and the shape of the draws and ridges. She'd done it partly out of the habit of a woman who had always paid attention to where she was, and partly from some instinct she couldn't name that said knowing this land was not optional. She was grateful for it now. The terrain rises about a mile north of here, she said, riding up beside Caleb. And there's a bowl on the other side of the rise. I saw it when we did the fence check last month. Sheltered from the northwest. If the cattle were moving with the wind, they'd naturally find it. Caleb looked at her. You noticed that on the fence check. I notice things, she said, not defensively, just as a fact. The bowl is maybe 3 miles from here, he said, if they got that far. He looked at the sky. We have maybe 5 hours of usable light. Then let's not use it standing still, she said. They rode. The landscape did what landscapes do in serious winter. It simplified. The colors went to white and gray and the dark lines of trees on the ridgelines, and the wind moved across the surface of the snow in patterns that were almost hypnotic if you let yourself look at them too long. Margaret didn't let herself look too long. She kept her attention moving, the ground ahead of Vera's feet, the distant ridgeline, Caleb's position to her left, the quality of the light, the direction of the wind. They found the first group of cattle 2 miles out, 11 head huddled against a granite outcrop, alive and not in obvious distress, but standing with the resigned stillness of animals that have stopped trying to make their situation better. Caleb and Margaret moved them back together with the practiced efficiency of people who had worked cattle together enough times that the communication was mostly gesture and positioning, Vera understanding what was needed with the calm competence that Margaret had come to love in her. 11, Caleb said, counting them as they turned them south. 52 to go, she said, if they all went north. They went north, she said. The wind pushed them north and the bowl pulled them north. The question is how many made it to the bowl and how many stopped somewhere between. They left the 11 with enough of a start in the right direction and kept riding. The temperature had dropped another degree or two while they were moving the first group. She could feel it in the quality of her breath, the way the air hurt slightly at the back of her throat. She checked her hands inside her gloves, flexing the fingers deliberately. Cold, but functional. She monitored this the way she monitored everything that mattered, regularly and without drama. The second group was harder to find. They'd gone east of the expected line, which meant either the wind had shifted at some point in the night or something else had turned them. When they finally found the tracks, 14 head, moving together more compactly than the first group, which meant they'd been moving in real cold for long enough to cluster, and followed them around a long, shallow curve in the terrain. Margaret understood what had happened. The tracks of a rider paralleled the cattle tracks on the eastern side, not a ranch hand checking on the herd. The rider had been pushing them, keeping them east of where they would naturally have gone, which explained the divergence. She stopped Vera and looked at the parallel tracks. Caleb had pulled up beside her. He saw what she was looking at. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "He planned this," Caleb said finally. His voice was completely level. She had noticed this about him, that anger for Caleb went inward and compressed rather than outward and loud. Someone cut the fence and then drove them, made it look like they just wandered. "He wanted to split the search," Margaret said. "Make it harder to recover all of them before the weather closed in. Maybe lose some to exposure." She looked at the tracks going east. "These didn't make the bowl." "No," he said. "They didn't." They followed the tracks east and found the 14 head in a narrow gully that had sheltered them from the wind, but also trapped them. The sides were steep enough that the cattle hadn't been able to work their way back out, and they'd been standing there for hours burning what reserves they had. Getting them out required Margaret holding Vera steady at the top of the gully, while Caleb went down on foot and worked them from below, and the 30 minutes that process took were the hardest of the day. The cold was serious now. The light was changing quality in the way that said afternoon was closer to ending than it felt, and she was maintaining her position on the rim with a focus that left no room for anything except what was directly in front of her. She talked to Vera quietly during those 30 minutes. Not meaningful words, just voice. The continuous, even sound of a human presence that told the horse the situation was manageable, because Vera could read uncertainty in a rider, and right now Margaret couldn't afford for Vera to read uncertainty. She said whatever came into her head. She described the quality of the light on the snow. She mentioned that the granite on the east face of the gully was a different color from the granite in the draw near the east fence, and she'd wondered about that. She talked about Elliot. The cattle came up out of the gully in a group, and Caleb came up after them, breathing hard and with snow packed into his coat sleeves up to the elbow. And he looked at her and said, 14. And she said, 25 to go. And they turned south. The bowl was real, and the cattle were in it. Not all 25, 17 clustered near the southern slope, where a stand of pine trees broke the wind enough to make the space marginally habitable. The other 8 had apparently not made it to the bowl, and were somewhere between there and the ranch, which meant another search on another day. And she could see in Caleb's face the calculation of what that meant in terms of time and exposure and odds. "We take these 17 now," she said. "The other 8. If they haven't found shelter, they're already in trouble, and rushing isn't going to change that. If they have found shelter, they'll still be there tomorrow." "Tomorrow might be worse," he said. He was looking at the sky. "Tonight might be worse," she said. "We have maybe an hour and a half of light." He knew she was right. She could see him accepting it and not liking it, which was fair. Not liking a correct decision didn't make it wrong. They turned the 17 south and began moving them back toward the ranch. It was on the return, with the cattle moving steadily ahead of them and the light going flat and gray across the snow, that Caleb's horse stumbled. Not dramatically. Fletcher was a solid horse, and he caught himself in 2 steps and kept moving, but those 2 steps were wrong. A hitch in the right foreleg that wasn't there before. A subtle favoring that a person who hadn't been watching carefully wouldn't have caught. Margaret caught it because she'd been watching Caleb as much as the terrain for the past hour, tracking his condition the way she tracked everything she was responsible for. "Fletcher's off," she said. Caleb slowed and looked down. He circled once and looked at the leg. "Ice ball in the shoe," he said. "Maybe, or something else." He dismounted carefully, and she watched him run his hand down Fletcher's foreleg in the cold, and she watched his face when he straightened. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough that I shouldn't push him the last 2 miles." She looked at the cattle. 17 head, moving well, pointed south. The ranch invisible in the distance behind the slope, but findable if you knew the terrain. She looked at the light. She looked at Caleb. "Can you lead him and keep the cattle moving?" she asked. "Alone?" "No. Not and keep them together." He was already working through options. She could see it. Neither of their options was good. A lame horse, 2 miles to cover, fading light, and 17 cattle that would scatter if they weren't properly managed. "Double up on Vera," she said. He looked at her. She can carry us both for 2 miles, Margaret said. She's carried heavier loads than 2 people in reasonable country. It's not comfortable, but it's possible. She looked at Fletcher. We tie his lead to the saddle and he walks easy. The cattle follow Vera's pace. We get everyone home. If Vera struggles, then we reassess, she said. But right now that is the best option available and we're losing light. He didn't argue further. What she'd come to understand about Caleb in the weeks since arriving was that he did not argue against correct things out of pride. He might have his first instinct and he might prefer a different option, but when a better option was presented plainly, he took it. That was not as common a quality as it should have been. Getting both of them onto Vera without upsetting the horse or the cattle required a particular kind of controlled practicality that left no room for self-consciousness. I took the front, she sat behind him and held the cantle with both hands, and Vera adjusted her footing deliberately in the way of a horse that understood the change in load and was deciding how to carry it. Fletcher's lead went to the left side of the saddle ring and they started south. It was close quarters. There was no way for it not to be. She could feel his back against her front with every step Vera took, and she was aware of this in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with, and set aside as firmly as possible for the duration of the ride. This was not the moment. This was survival logistics, and she treated it as such. What she noticed anyway, despite her best efforts to not notice anything irrelevant, was that his breathing was off. Not dramatically, just slightly faster than the level of exertion required, and shallower. She'd heard this before. Her husband Robert had done it in the last year of his life when his heart was working harder than it should have been, though for entirely different reasons. She pressed her attention against the rhythm of it and decided it was tension rather than physical trouble. The accumulated tension of a man who had watched his ranch threatened for months, and now spent a day in serious cold recovering what should never have been taken, and who was carrying it all in the particular private way that men of his type carried things they didn't know how to put down. She didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say. What she did, without deciding to do it, was ease her grip from the cantle and put one hand flat against his back, between the shoulder blades. Still, the way you put your hand on something you're trying to steady. He didn't react outwardly. Fletcher walked quietly behind them. The cattle moved south in the gray light. Vera's stride settled into something even and deliberate. They rode the last 2 miles like that without talking, and the dark came down around them with the range opening up ahead, showing the distant lights of the ranch house, where she knew Arlo and Elliot were waiting. The ranch hands found the other 8 cattle 2 days later, sheltered in a shallow creek bed 1.5 miles east of the main property. 4 were fine. 3 had exposure damage that required care but were likely to recover. 1 didn't make it, and Caleb wrote the number in his ledger with the same flat expression he'd used when he said helped about the fence post, and didn't say anything else about it. Wade Holloway said nothing publicly about the fence. There was nothing he could say. The rider's tracks Margaret had noticed near the second group of cattle had been photographed, if a photograph could be taken in those conditions, in the sense that Caleb had described them in detail to Ruth Hadley, and Ruth had described them to the land office representative who passed through Silver Creek in the first week of February. Not as evidence exactly, as context, as the building of a record. Margaret had suggested this. She'd suggested it the way she suggested most things, quietly, specifically, with reasoning attached. Wade is operating on the assumption that we can't prove direct connection, she'd said. So we don't try to prove direct connection yet. We build a record of pattern. Enough of a pattern that when March comes and the land judge hears this case, there's a context around the legal argument that explains who benefits from Caleb's problems and when those problems started. Ruth had been the one to carry the record, because Ruth was known and trusted in Silver Creek in a way that Caleb, as the party in the legal dispute, was not. She did it without being asked twice and without requiring any explanation of why it mattered. She was a woman who had lived in a frontier town for 30 years and understood very well how things got decided and by whom. February was quieter than January, which Margaret trusted less than noise. Wade Holloway was not a man who gave up. He was a man who recalculated. The silence meant he was recalculating, and what came after recalculation was usually a different kind of move. She spent February's quieter days doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was preparing the legal case she had written, by the third week of February, a careful document that organized all of Caleb's evidence in chronological order with the 1869 letter from the land office as its anchor, cited the relevant survey methodology, and identified the specific inconsistencies in Wade's surveyor's position. She was not a lawyer. She said this plainly in the document's opening, which Caleb had read twice, and then looked at her in a way she'd come to associate with the specific surprise of a person who keeps encountering competence where they didn't expect it. She was not a lawyer, but she could organize an argument, and this argument was organized. The second thing she was doing was watching Elliot. He had changed again. He was still changing, in fact, in the way children change when they are in the right environment. Not abruptly, but continuously, like something in growth that you don't notice day to day, but that is visibly different when measured across weeks. He had gotten taller, which was partially just time, and partially, she suspected, the effect of daily physical work and consistent food. He had gotten more confident in the specific way that comes from accumulated competence, from knowing how to do things, real things, things that mattered. But what she was watching for was something more particular. She had noticed that Elliot, in the weeks after the cattle recovery, had started sitting closer to Caleb in the evenings. Not dramatically, not curled against him or anything that announced itself. Just closer, within arm's reach instead of across the room. And she had noticed that Caleb, without any visible adjustment or acknowledgement, had started angling slightly toward the boy in return. The way two things naturally orient toward each other without either of them deciding to. She watched this happening and felt the particular complicated love of a mother who understands that what her child needs most right now is something she cannot personally provide, and that providing it requires knowing when to stay out of the way. It was during one of these evenings, in the second week of February, that Elliot asked Caleb a question that Margaret heard from the kitchen doorway. "Were you scared?" Elliot asked. "When you and Mom went out in the cold to find the cattle?" She stayed in the doorway, not announcing herself. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Some." "What were you scared of?" Another pause. "Losing things I didn't want to lose," he said. Elliot considered this with the gravity he brought to things that mattered. "The cattle?" "The cattle," Caleb said, "and other things." She went quietly back into the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. Her chest felt too full for the space available. Then she put the kettle on, because the water needed heating and because the day still had things in it that needed doing, and she got on with it. The land judge arrived in Silver Creek on a Tuesday in the first week of March, 3 days earlier than expected, which meant that Wade Holloway's lawyer from Billings had not yet arrived, and the hearing was delayed until Thursday. Those 2 extra days were a gift Margaret hadn't expected, and she used them. She spent Wednesday afternoon in Ruth's store, sitting at the counter with Ruth's coffee and her own carefully organized document, going through the argument one more time. Not because the argument had changed, but because she needed to think it through from the outside, the way a person checks a map before a journey, even when they already know the route. Ruth sat across from her and asked the hard questions, the ones a skeptical judge would ask, the ones that didn't have comfortable answers. And Margaret worked through them one at a time, and when she didn't have a good answer for something, she said so, and Ruth asked the next question. "The 1869 letter," Ruth said. "Wade's lawyer will say it's too old to be definitive, that the boundary conditions changed in the interim." "They didn't change," Margaret said. "The cottonwood fell, but the land office letter describes its position in relation to the creek bed, which hasn't materially changed. If anything, the flood of '81 reinforced the creek's position. It cut deeper in the same channel. It didn't shift course." She looked at her notes. "We have the creek's position documented in the '79 survey and the '83 survey, and they're consistent with the '69 description. 3 data points in 14 years, all showing the same relationship." "The '83 survey is the same surveyor Wade is using," Ruth said. "Which is a problem for Wade," Margaret said, "because if his surveyor's own most recent work contradicts his current testimony, one of the two is inaccurate. Either the '83 survey was wrong, which undermines Wade's claim, since he's relying on the same man's authority, or the current testimony is wrong. Either way, there's a credibility problem." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You should be there," she said, "at the hearing. Caleb will present it." "Caleb's a good man, he's not a talker," Ruth said flatly. "Lawyers talk, judges talk. Wade's Billings attorney is going to talk. Caleb standing there being honest isn't going to be enough against someone who knows how to frame an argument. Margaret looked at her. Women don't generally address the land court. Women don't generally save cattle herds in January snowstorms either, Ruth said, from what I understand. Margaret looked back at her document. The argument was good. She knew it was good. The problem with a good argument was that it was only as effective as the person presenting it. I'll talk to Caleb, she said. Caleb's response, when she raised it that evening, was not what she expected. She'd prepared for resistance. She'd organized her reasoning. She'd anticipated his likely objections. She'd framed it as practical rather than personal. She sat down across from him after Elliot was in bed and she laid it out clearly. Ruth's observation, the specific weakness of a nonverbal presentation against a practiced legal advocate, the value of having someone at the table who had built the argument and could respond in real time to challenges. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "I know." She stopped. "I've been thinking the same thing since last week," he said. "I just wasn't sure how to say it without—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't want you to think I was asking you to do something I should be able to do myself." She looked at him. "You can do plenty of things yourself," she said. "That's not the question. The question is what gives us the best chance on Thursday." "You do," he said, simply. "You give us the best chance." She held that for a moment. It was not a comfortable thing to be relied on. Comfort was not the right word for it. It was weightier than comfortable. It required something of her, this particular kind of trust, in a way that affection or admiration wouldn't have. "All right," she said, "then I'll need to speak to the judge before the hearing starts, to establish standing." She looked at the document. "And I need you to not react to anything Wade's lawyer says, regardless of what it is. The fastest way to undermine a good argument is to let the other side make you angry in public." Caleb looked at her with the expression she recognized. "Can I be angry in private?" "After," she said. "As much as you want, after." The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close. "Deal," he said. She went to bed that night with the document on the table and Thursday 3 days away, and the particular focused calm that she had discovered in herself over the past months. The thing that lived on the other side of fear when you walked through it instead of around it. Outside, the temperature was still below what it should have been for March. But the sky, for the first time in weeks, had a different quality to it. Not warmth yet, but the memory of warmth, the distant possibility of it. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, filed it away, kept moving. The land judge's name was Everett Cale, and he was not what Margaret had pictured. She had pictured someone imposing, the frontier version of the Boston judges she had seen occasionally in the courthouse near Beacon Hill, men who wore their authority like a second coat. Everett Cale was a small man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was always running a conversation parallel to the one actually happening. He arrived Thursday morning in a buggy driven by a young clerk who looked cold and unhappy, and he walked into the Silver Creek Meeting Hall, which served as courtroom, town assembly space, and occasional overflow lodging, apparently. Without any ceremony, set his bag on the front table and began reading papers before anyone had formally greeted him. Margaret had arrived 40 minutes early. This was not an accident. She had thought carefully about how to establish her presence before the hearing began, because the easier problem to solve was the one that didn't become a problem in the first place. If she walked in with Caleb when the hearing was already convened, her presence would require explanation at a moment when explanations disrupted the proceedings. If she was already there, already settled, already familiar to the room, her presence simply became part of the landscape. She had also dressed carefully. Not to impress, she didn't own anything designed to impress, and she wouldn't have worn it here if she did. She had dressed to be taken seriously, which was a different and more specific calculation. The gray dress she'd brought from Boston, the one she'd worn when Robert's firm needed her to attend a formal occasion and wanted her to look like a wife rather than a liability. It was plain and well-made and communicated without announcing anything that the person wearing it had standards and met them. Ruth had looked at her when she came down the stairs of the boarding house where they'd stayed the night and said, "Good," which was Ruth's version of a standing ovation. She introduced herself to Everett Cale before anyone else arrived. Not with her full situation, She wasn't naive enough to lead with complexity when simplicity served. She told him she was Margaret Whitmore, that she was Caleb Dawson's intended, and had been managing the household and records of Dawson Ranch since November, and that she had organized and could speak to the documentary evidence supporting Mr. Dawson's position. Cale looked at her over the papers he was still holding. He had sharp gray eyes that moved faster than the rest of him suggested. Together the filing? He said. Yes. The argument about the surveyor's internal inconsistency? That was yours? She hadn't known he'd already read it. Ruth must have delivered it to his lodgings the night before, which was exactly the kind of move Ruth made without mentioning she was going to make it. It was, she said. He looked at her for another moment with those quick eyes. Then he looked back at his papers. You may address the proceeding as a representative of the respondent's interests, he said, as though this were a routine administrative decision rather than something that had approximately no precedent in Silver Creek's legal history. Sit at the table. She sat at the table, sound. Wade Holloway arrived 20 minutes later with his lawyer from Billings, a man named Arthur Fenn, who was everything Margaret had expected, tall, well-dressed, in the particular way of men who travel professionally, carrying a leather case that announced its own importance. Fenn swept the room with a single evaluative look when he entered, the way lawyers do when they are assessing who is present and what it means, and his look landed on Margaret at the respondent's table and stayed there for a fraction of a second longer than everything else. She held his gaze steadily and then went back to her notes. Wade himself looked at her with an expression she had trouble categorizing. Not surprise, exactly. He'd known she existed and known she was capable of inconvenience. Something closer to reassessment. The recalculation she'd predicted 2 months ago in the kitchen, visible now on his face as he understood that she was not just present, but formally positioned. Caleb came in with Arlo, who had insisted on attending and whom no one had argued with because arguing with Arlo about something he'd decided was a reliable waste of time. Ruth was in the public rows with Adeline. Clara Sims was there too, which Margaret noted. Patricia Greer was in the back with 2 other women from the church committee, which she also noted. The shape of a room before something important happens tells you what to expect when it does. Caleb sat beside her and looked at Arthur Fenn setting up at the other table and then looked at Margaret. He's good, he said quietly. Probably, she said. That's fine. Good and right aren't the same thing. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked forward. She could feel him organizing himself, the same internal process she did herself before something that required everything from her. She respected him for it, that he did it quietly and without asking her to manage it. Don't react, she reminded him softly. I know, he said. I mean it. Whatever Fenn says about the survey, whatever he implies, whatever Wade does with his face when you're being described, nothing. We let the documents speak. Margaret. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for months now. Plain, but not careless. I know. She nodded and looked at her papers. Arthur Fenn opened with confidence, which she had expected, and with a version of the facts that was impressively selective, which she had also expected. He presented Wade Holloway's position as straightforward. The flood survey of 1881 had established a revised boundary. The North Pasture had effectively been operating in disputed territory for 2 years without formal resolution, and the survey documentation supported Wade's claim to approximately 40 acres of that pasture. That was good. She gave him that. He moved through the argument with the ease of a man who had done this dozens of times in territorial courts across Montana, who knew which phrases landed with judges and which created unnecessary resistance, who understood the rhythm of legal persuasion the way a musician understands timing. He said nothing about the 1869 letter for the first 15 minutes. That told her he knew about it and was deciding how to handle it. She waited. When Fenn finally addressed it, he did what she'd predicted to Ruth. He called it a historical document without current legal weight, citing the changed conditions following the 1881 flood, the absence of the original boundary marker, and the inherent unreliability of correspondence that predated formal surveying standards. Judge Cale looked up from his notes. What surveying standards are you referencing, Mr. Fenn? A small pause. The territorial standards established in 1875, which postdate the letter by 6 years, Cale said. It wasn't a question. Correct, Your Honor, which is precisely... What specifically in those 1875 standards renders the 1869 documentation unreliable? Cale asked. He had the manner of someone asking because he genuinely wanted the answer, which made it harder to deflect. Fenn adjusted. He had a good answer, something about measurement instrumentation and the standardization of survey markers, and he delivered it competently. But the adjustment had cost him half a step, and Margaret saw Cale note it in his own particular way, which was a slight movement of his pen that wasn't quite writing anything down. When it was the respondent's time, she stood up. She was aware of the room, Patricia Greer in the back, straightening slightly, Clara Sims watching with her head tilted. The two ranch hands from Wade's outfit who'd come as witnesses, shifting. Wade Holloway himself, who had the stillness of a man controlling his expression with some effort. She addressed the 1869 letter first. Not defensively. She didn't frame it as a rebuttal to Fenn's characterization. She framed it as the foundation of the entire chronology, the earliest fixed point from which every subsequent survey could be measured and verified. She walked Judge Cale through the three surveys in order, noting the consistent relationship between the creek bed and the northern boundary across 14 years and across 3 different measuring occasions. She noted that the variation between the 3 surveys was within the expected range of surveying error for the period, and that all 3 surveys, when their measurements were plotted, placed the boundary in a location consistent with the 1869 letter and inconsistent with Wade Holloway's current claim. Then she addressed the surveyor. She did it without accusation. She did it with the particular careful neutrality of a person presenting facts that are damaging enough on their own to not require editorial comment. She placed the 83 survey beside the current testimony and walked through the specific measurement discrepancy. Not a large one, not dramatic, but precise and verifiable, between what the surveyor had recorded in his own prior work and what he was now prepared to testify. These 2 documents cannot both be accurate, she said. Either the 1883 survey was incorrect, which raises questions about the reliability of the surveyor's methodology generally, or the current testimony departs from his own prior recorded findings, which raises a different question. The respondent takes no position on which of these is true. We simply ask the court to note that the conflict exists and to consider what it implies about the evidentiary weight of the testimony being offered. Judge Cale was writing something down. Actual writing this time. Arthur Fenn objected to her characterization. She responded to the objection directly, citing the specific measurement figures from both documents by page and notation. Fenn objected again. She waited for him to finish and then continued. She presented the pattern document last, the organized record of events from November through February that Ruth had helped build, presented not as evidence of wrongdoing but as context. The fence, the cattle, the timeline, the letter to Arlo. She said none of it was proven to connect to the legal claim before the court. She said the court might find it useful background for understanding the circumstances surrounding the dispute. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has been said that requires adjustment before anyone can respond normally. Caleb was looking forward. She could see his jaw was tight, but his hands on the table were still. I was keeping his word. She put her own hands flat on the table and waited. Judge Cale took an hour. He went into the back office that Silver Creek's town council used for their meetings, taking the documents with him, and the meeting hall slowly filled with the sound of people who had been holding their breath beginning to breathe again. Wade Holloway spoke in low tones with Arthur Fenn. Margaret could not hear what they were saying and did not try to. Caleb got up and walked to the window and stood there looking at the street outside. And Arlo went and stood near him without talking, and that was its own kind of conversation. Ruth appeared at Margaret's elbow with a cup of coffee that had come from somewhere Margaret couldn't identify and didn't question. "You were good," Ruth said. "We don't know yet," Margaret said. "You were good," Ruth repeated. "Regardless." Margaret drank the coffee. It was terrible, thin and slightly burnt in the way of coffee made in large quantities for an indifferent crowd, and she drank it gratefully. The hour passed the way hours pass when the outcome of something important is pending, not slowly or quickly, but with a strange irregularity, some minutes feeling stretched and others collapsed. She spent it reviewing her own argument in her mind, looking for the places where she could have been clearer, more precise, more anticipatory of Fenn's objections. She found 3. She cataloged them not with regret, but with the intention of doing better next time, whenever next time was, whatever it concerned. When Judge Cale came back, He set the documents on the table in a neat stack and looked at both tables with the expression of a man about to say something he has decided and is not interested in revisiting. He ruled for Caleb, not in the elaborate language of a delivered judgment. He wasn't that kind of judge, apparently, and this wasn't that kind of court. He said, in plain language that took about 3 minutes, that the documentary evidence presented by the respondent established a consistent and credible boundary record that predated and superseded the claimant's survey interpretation. He said the surveyor's inconsistency between his 1883 work and his current testimony was a material concern that he was noting in the record. He said the claim was dismissed and the north pasture remained within the legal boundaries of Dawson Ranch. Then he picked up his bag and said something to his clerk and walked out. The room reorganized itself in the way rooms do when a tension that has been building for months suddenly releases, not cleanly or all at once, but in stages, different people processing at different speeds. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word. Arlo turned from the window and walked back toward the table with the same unhurried pace he walked everywhere, but his eyes had something in them. Caleb stood still for a moment. Then he turned from the window and looked at Margaret across the room. She looked back at him. There were things that could have been said. She was aware of several of them. None of them seemed necessary. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took both her hands in his, her hands that were still on the table, that had been flat on the table since she sat down, and held them for a moment without squeezing, just held them, and she felt in that contact the weight of everything the past 4 months had been and everything that had almost gone wrong and hadn't. "Thank you," he said, quietly, just to her. "We did it," she said, also quietly. He shook his head slightly. "No, you did it. I would have stood up there and been honest and lost." He looked at her, not with the particular softness that men perform when they think they're being romantic, with something plainer and more serious than that. "I need you to know that." She held his gaze and let herself receive that, which was harder than it sounded, accepting something that was true without deflecting it or minimizing it. She had a habit of deflecting. She was aware of it. She was working on it. "All right," she said. He released her hands when Arlo arrived at the table, and the moment folded back into the ordinary. Wade Holloway left the meeting hall without speaking to anyone. Arthur Fenn followed him, already repacking his leather case with the professional equanimity of a man who loses cases occasionally and doesn't take it personally. The witnesses from Wade's outfit shuffled out after. In their wake, the room felt larger. March changed things in Silver Creek in ways that were difficult to trace to any single event. This was how community opinion shifted, Margaret had learned. Not through declarations or confrontations, but through small recalibrations. Individual people quietly revising their assessments without publicly acknowledging they'd ever held the previous ones. It was the social equivalent of what had happened in the survey documents, a recorded position quietly abandoned and replaced with something more defensible, without the record of the change ever being clearly acknowledged. Patricia Greer stopped her on the street 2 weeks after the hearing, in the particular way Patricia Greer stopped people, as if the conversation were already in progress, and Margaret had simply walked into it. She said she hoped the legal matter was behind them now, and that Silver Creek could look forward to a settled season. She said the Women's Charitable Association was planning a spring gathering, and she hoped Margaret would consider attending. She did not say she had been wrong about Margaret. She did not say she regretted anything. But the invitation was real, and Margaret accepted it in the same spirit it was offered, not as reconciliation, but as the beginning of the possibility of it. Clara Sims was different. Clara Sims came to the ranch in April with her daughter, who was 9, and who apparently had developed a determined interest in learning to read more fluently than her schooling had provided. She asked, with a directness that Margaret suspected had been rehearsed several times in the mirror, whether Margaret would be willing to help the girl with her reading once a week. Margaret said yes. It was the right answer practically and personally, and it was also, she understood, the answer that had the most strategic value in terms of Silver Creek's continued reassessment of her. Clara Sims's daughter, reading better, because of Margaret Whitmore, was the kind of thing that became a story. And stories were how a community revised its own narrative about itself and the people in it. Elliot noticed Clara Sims's daughter on her first visit, a girl named Agnes with red hair and a combative attitude toward books that Elliot clearly found both baffling and interesting, and sat nearby during the reading session with the air of someone who was definitely doing something else entirely and just happened to be in the same room. By the third session, Agnes and Elliot had developed a negotiated coexistence that occasionally involved her reading aloud to him, and him correcting her pronunciation with the patient authority of a child who had been reading since he was 4 and knew it. Margaret watched this from across the room and thought, so that's how it starts. The other change of April was the one she had known was coming since Christmas and had been waiting for with a patience she sometimes had to actively maintain. Caleb had not spoken again about what he'd said at the kitchen table in December. She had not expected him to. He was not a man who said things twice, who circled back to emotional territory he'd already crossed with the intention of elaborating. He had said what he said, and he meant it, and he assumed she knew it, which she did. But knowing something and its formal acknowledgement were different, and she was 35 years old and had buried one husband and crossed half a continent with a 6-year-old and fought a land case in a territorial court, and she had learned that she did not do well with indefinite states. It was a Sunday in late April. Arlo had gone to Silver Creek. Elliot was in the barn with Belle the mare, who had foaled in the first week of March. Elliot's prediction had been accurate to within 4 days, which he had recorded with quiet satisfaction. And the foal, a chestnut filly he had named, after careful deliberation, Compass. Caleb was fixing a hinge on the kitchen door that had been sticking since February, and should have been fixed in February, and had not been, because February had been entirely occupied with other things. It was a small domestic repair, the kind of thing that happens in the margins of larger events. And he was doing it with the focused attention he brought to all practical tasks, which she had always found oddly calming to observe. She was at the kitchen table reviewing the ranch accounts, which she had fully taken over in January at Caleb's request, and which were, she felt, significantly improved from the state they'd been in when she started. Not because Caleb had been careless, but because he thought in terms of cattle and land and weather, and not in terms of columns. She said without preamble, "I think we should talk about what happens next." He looked at her from the doorway, holding the hinge. "Next?" "The legal matter is resolved," she said. "Winter is over. The ranch is in better condition than it was in November." She kept her voice even and her eyes on the accounts. The reasons for the current arrangement were practical ones, and the practical situation has changed. A silence. She could hear him processing this, not with confusion, because Caleb did not confuse easily, but with the careful attention he gave things that mattered. "Are you telling me you want to leave?" he said. His voice was completely level. Completely. Which told her more than inflection would have. "No," she said. She looked up from the accounts. "I'm telling you that the arrangement we came in on, the uncertainty of it, the provisional nature of it, I don't do well with provisional over a long period of time. I'm not built for it." She held his gaze. "And I think you're not either." He set the hinge down on the counter. He turned to face her fully. "I've known what I wanted since January," he said. "Since before January. I didn't say it because I didn't want you to feel pressed into something you hadn't chosen freely." He paused. "This hasn't been what you signed up for. The legal fight, the winter, Wade's tactics. I wanted to give you room to decide whether you still—" "Caleb." She said his name the way he said hers, plainly, without theater. "I decided in February. I was waiting for you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, because Caleb's face rarely did anything dramatically, but visibly. The release of something held carefully for a long time. "Then I'm asking," he said, formally, "if you'll marry me." He glanced around the kitchen with a slight expression that was the closest thing to self-conscious she'd ever seen on him. "I don't have a ring. I should have a ring." "I don't need a ring," she said. "I know you don't need one. I'd like to get you one." "Then get me one later," she said. "Yes. The answer is yes." He crossed the kitchen, and she stood up from the table, and he put his hands on her face, his large, work-roughened, careful hands, and kissed her. And it was not a graceful moment in the way that fictional romantic moments are graceful because real moments rarely are. Her elbow hit the back of the chair when she stood. He was slightly too tall for the angle and had to adjust. The account scattered off the table when her hand caught the edge of it. None of that mattered. When they separated, she was looking at him from approximately 6 inches away and seeing the lines in his face that winter and hard work had made, and the gray coming in at his temples that she hadn't noticed before because she hadn't been this close, and the expression in his eyes that was relief and certainty combined. And she thought, this is a real thing. Not a perfect thing, not a smooth thing, a real one. Elliot, he said. I wanted to talk to Elliot. I know, she said. I'll get him. Botam. She walked to the barn and found her son in the stall with Compass, the chestnut filly who was 6 weeks old and already had opinions about everything, including Elliot, whom she had apparently decided was acceptable. Elliot was sitting in the straw with the filly's head in his lap, which was not a thing that was supposed to happen so early in a young horse's training, and which Elliot had clearly allowed to happen through some combination of patience and the particular quality of stillness he'd had since he was an infant. Caleb wants to talk to you, Margaret said. Elliot looked up. Something in her face told him something because he was 7 years old and perceptive in the particular way of children who have been paying attention to adult emotional states for reasons of self-preservation since before they could name what they were doing. His expression changed slightly. Is it good or bad? He asked. Come find out, she said. She walked him back to the house and stopped in the kitchen doorway, and did not follow him in, because this was not her conversation. This was his. She stood in the doorway and heard Caleb say, Come sit down a minute, and heard Elliot's footsteps on the kitchen floor, and then she walked away because she didn't need to hear the rest. She went to the east fence line, the third section, the one that had been repaired in January after the sabotage, the one where the posts were still slightly newer than the others around them, a visible mark of the thing that had been done and the thing that had been answered. She stood there in the April sun, which was real sun now, carrying actual warmth, the kind that went past the surface and reached something. She stood there for a while. When she came back, Elliot was in the kitchen helping Caleb reassemble the hinge on the door. They were working in the focused parallel silence of two people occupied with the same task, Elliot holding the door steady, while Caleb set the screws and Caleb saying, Hold it level, not tilted, and Elliot making the small adjustment without being told twice. She stood in the yard and watched them through the open door. She could not see Elliot's face from this angle, only the back of his head, the dark hair that looked more like Robert every month, and also, she had begun to think, less exclusively like Robert as the months passed, as if the boy inside it was becoming more specifically himself, and less a composite of his origins. Caleb looked up and saw her in the yard. Whatever he saw in her face made him say something quietly to Elliot, and Elliot turned and looked at her, and his expression was the one she'd been watching for since they'd left Boston, the one that appeared when he stopped calculating and just existed in a moment without guarding against it. We fixed it, he said, meaning the hinge. I can see that, she said. He turned back to examine their work with the satisfaction of someone who has done a useful thing and knows it. Caleb's eyes stayed on Margaret for a moment longer, and in that moment was everything that didn't require words. The acknowledgement of what had just been decided, the weight of it, the fact that it was right. Then he looked back at the door too, testing the swing of it, and said, Finally. And Elliot said, It was sticking on the left, with the authority of someone who had been observing this problem for months. And Caleb said, I know it was sticking on the left. And Elliot said, Just making sure you noticed. Margaret laughed. The sound of it surprised her slightly, the full, uncalculated quality of it. The kind of laugh that happens when something is genuinely funny and your body doesn't ask permission first. Caleb looked at her with his almost smile. She came inside and closed the door behind her, the door that swung cleanly now, that didn't stick. And the smell of the kitchen and the sound of the two of them and the April light through the good glass windows all settled around her, and she thought, this is the place. Not perfect, not easy, not without the marks of everything it had cost to get here, but hers. Theirs. She went to put the kettle on. Ruth Hadley organized a small celebration at her store on the first Saturday of May, because Ruth organized things, and because the occasion warranted it, and because Silver Creek, in Ruth's view, needed more occasions to act like a community and fewer to act like a collection of individuals managing adjacent suspicions. She invited people Margaret would have expected and several she wouldn't have. Clara Sims came with Agnes, who spent most of the evening interrogating Elliot about whether Compass had learned any new behaviors since their last conversation, which was a week ago. Patricia Greer came and was not warm but was genuinely present, which Margaret had learned to distinguish from performance. Arlo came and stood in the corner near the wood stove with a cup of something and said approximately 4 words all evening, 2 of which were congratulations and 1 of which was directed at Ruth. Dr. Sims, Clara's husband, whom Margaret had barely met, turned out to be a compact, cheerful man who shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Margaret and said, "You're the one who organized the case against Wade?" And when she said yes, he said, "Clara told me about the surveyor argument. That was very well done," with the uncomplicated approval of someone offering a professional opinion, and she felt, unexpectedly, the particular warmth of being recognized by someone who had the standing to evaluate what they were recognizing. Wade Holloway was not invited. This was Ruth's decision, and she did not explain it, and nobody asked her to. What Margaret learned later from Ruth, in the casual way Ruth delivered significant information as if it were an afterthought, was that Wade had quietly begun negotiations to sell a portion of his eastern property to a cattle buyer from Helena. The legal defeat had apparently done something to his position that went beyond the specific claim. She didn't ask for details, and Ruth didn't offer them. It was enough to know that the particular pressure he'd applied to Dawson Ranch for the past 6 months had dissipated, not with drama, but with the quiet deflation of something that had run out of sustainable force. Caleb heard this news with a face that didn't change much. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good." And that was all. Margaret looked at him and thought about the ledger entry for the one cattle they'd lost in January, and about Fletcher's leg, and about the night they'd ridden double across 2 miles of frozen range. And she thought that Caleb's one-word response to Wade's retreat contained more history than most people's speeches. Elliot fell asleep on Ruth's settee around 9 o'clock, in the same way he'd fallen asleep on their own settee at Christmas, suddenly and completely, as if his body had simply decided the day was done and implemented the decision without consulting anyone. Ruth found an extra blanket and covered him with it without making a production of it, and when Margaret thanked her, she waved it off. "He's a good boy," Ruth said. "He's the best person I know," Margaret said, simply because it was true, and she was in the kind of mood where true things said themselves. Ruth looked at her with the expression she sometimes wore, the one that contained decades of observation and had made its peace with most of what it had seen. "You did right by him," she said. "Coming here, it wasn't the easy thing." "No," Margaret agreed. "Most people do the easy thing." "I know." "That's what makes it matter," Ruth said, and went to refill her own cup before the conversation could become sentimental, which was also very Ruth. On the ride home that night, Caleb driving, Elliot asleep in the wagon bed wrapped in the blanket Ruth had sent along, the May air finally carrying the real warmth of a season, actually arriving. Margaret sat beside Caleb in the same seat where she'd sat the first day he drove her out from Silver Creek, when she'd known him for 45 minutes, and was cataloging what his letters had failed to tell her. She knew him now. Not completely. She wasn't sure you ever knew a person completely, and she was suspicious of people who thought they did. But genuinely. The parts that showed under pressure, which were the parts that mattered, the patience that wasn't passivity, the directness that wasn't unkindness, the particular quality of his silence, which she'd learned to read the way she'd learned to read the sky, by proximity and repetition and the willingness to pay attention. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. It was late and dark, and the stars were out in the particular density they got out here, away from town, where there was nothing between you and them. She'd grown up with city skies and still wasn't entirely used to this. "November," she said, getting off the stagecoach. He was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" "Terrified," she said, "but I'd decided, so it didn't matter." He looked at the road ahead. "Wait on the step, that was the first thing." "Yes." "I should have been there." "You couldn't have known the time," she said. "And if you'd been there, I wouldn't have found out what I needed to know." He looked at her briefly. "What did you find out?" "What we were dealing with," she said. "And what you weren't." She paused. "You weren't the kind of man who would do that. I needed to confirm it, but it was already in the letters. I just needed to see the contrast." He was quiet for a while. The wagon moved through the dark, and Elliot breathed steadily in the back, and the horses found their own pace home. "The advertisement," Caleb said. "I wrote it 6 times. She looked at him. 6 drafts, he said. I kept thinking, nobody's going to answer this. It's too plain. It's too blunt. It doesn't say the right things. And then I thought, the person I want to find is someone who would answer this version, so I sent it." She held that for a moment. She thought about her own letter back. The Tuesday evening in the borrowed room while Elliot slept, the careful, honest accounting of what she was and what she wasn't. We were both right, she said. Yeah, he said. We were. The ranch lights appeared ahead in the dark, the way they had on the first night she'd seen them, like something that had grown from the land rather than been built on it. They looked different now, not because they'd changed, but because she had a different relationship to them. They were hers to come home to. Caleb pulled the wagon up, and she climbed down, and he handed down the sleeping Elliot, who was heavier than he looked, and who stirred briefly and then settled back into sleep against her shoulder. She carried him inside and put him in his cot and pulled the blanket up, and he had the face of a child who was entirely at rest, which was the face she'd been working toward for years without fully knowing it. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen where Caleb was checking the stove, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen floor and thought about how 4 months ago this room had been a place she was trying to make her own, and now it simply was. The stove ticked. The night pressed close outside the windows. She thought about Wade Holloway's retreating position, about the north pasture that would feed the herd this summer, about Clara Sims's daughter, Agnes, getting better at reading 1 week at a time, about Elliot and Compass and the particular settled quality Elliot's shoulders had now that they hadn't had in Boston. There was still so much that could go wrong. She knew that. The frontier was not a place where things stayed fixed. It was a place where things had to be maintained constantly, where the next season was always capable of being harder than the last, where permanence was not a state you achieved and kept, but a thing you worked toward every day without guarantee. She knew that. She had crossed half a continent and fought a land case in a territorial court and ridden into a January storm for 63 cattle, and she knew that better than almost anything. She was not afraid of it. She was, for the first time since Robert died, entirely where she intended to be. That was enough. More than enough. She went to help Caleb bank the stove for the night, and the house settled around them, and outside the May sky held more stars than she would ever finish counting. They were married on a Saturday in early June, which was Ruth Hadley's suggestion and Caleb's preference and Margaret's practical agreement, because June in Montana was the closest thing to reliable that the weather offered, and reliability was something she had learned to value above almost everything else. The ceremony was small. That was also her preference, stated plainly when Ruth began mentioning the various ways Silver Creek could involve itself in the occasion. Margaret had said, with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered, something small. The people who actually know us, not a performance. Ruth had looked at her for a moment and then nodded and arranged exactly that, because Ruth understood the difference between a celebration and a performance better than most people, and she had opinions about which one was worth having. It happened in the yard of Dawson Ranch, under a sky that was the particular deep blue of early summer mornings before the heat settled in. Arlo stood to Caleb's left. Ruth stood to Margaret's right. Elliot stood slightly in front of both of them, because that was where he'd positioned himself when they were arranging, and nobody had suggested he move. And the arrangement felt right in a way that formal protocol wouldn't have improved. The justice of the peace was a man named Horace Webb, who rode circuit and who had the air of someone who had married several hundred couples and found each one genuinely interesting, which Margaret appreciated. He said what needed saying without embellishment, and they said what needed saying back, and the whole of it took less than 12 minutes. And when it was done, Caleb took her hand and held it without any theatrical gesture, and that was exactly correct. Elliot had been watching with his particular focused attention throughout. When it was over, he looked at Caleb with an expression that Margaret recognized as the face he made when he was deciding how to say something he'd already decided to say. "Are you my dad now?" he asked. Straightforward. No ceremony in it. Caleb looked at him. "If you want me to be," he said. Elliot thought about this for approximately 2 seconds, which for Elliot was a short deliberation. "Okay," he said. And then he turned and went to check on Compass, because Elliot processed significant emotional events by immediately returning to something concrete and manageable, which was a quality Margaret had always recognized in him because she did exactly the same thing. Caleb watched him go. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to manage or contain. She saw it and looked away, because some things deserved their private moment. Ruth opened a bottle of something she'd been keeping for the right occasion, and they drank it in the yard in the June morning, and it was very good, and nobody made a speech, and the day continued. The summer that followed was the hardest working season Margaret had experienced in her life, and she had experienced some genuinely difficult seasons. The North pasture, The 40 acres that Wade Holloway had spent the winter trying to claim, and the court had confirmed as theirs, turned out to be everything Caleb had said it was. The grazing was exceptional, the kind of deep-rooted grass that came from decades of undisturbed growth, and the herd moved into it in June and filled out visibly over the following weeks. Caleb watched this happen with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been right about something important and had the scars to prove why it mattered. The ranch expanded its operation that summer in 3 specific ways that Margaret had helped plan over the winter. A second hayfield, using the land along the northern creek boundary that had been underutilized because the previous fence line had made access awkward. A formal arrangement with Dr. Sims for veterinary consultations on the herd, because it turned out Dr. Sims had studied animal medicine before human medicine and kept current on both, which was useful and also explained something about the kind of person he was. And a small kitchen garden, which was Margaret's project, and which she undertook with no illusions about frontier gardening. It was difficult and inconsistent, and the first planting lost half its yield to a late cold snap in May that nobody had predicted, but which by August was producing enough that she was putting things up for winter with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent a bad January eating salt pork and understood viscerally why variety mattered. Elliot helped with the garden. This surprised her because Elliot had made clear he preferred the barn and the horses to most other things, and gardening did not involve horses. But he appeared at her side one morning while she was working the soil in the 3rd row and crouched down and started pulling the obvious weeds with the methodical attention he brought to all physical tasks. And she didn't remark on it, and he came back the next day. And by July, it was simply a thing they did together in the early mornings before the heat set in. She thought sometimes about what she would have said, in Boston, if someone had described this to her. Herself at 35 in a kitchen garden in Montana at 6 in the morning, her hands in the soil, her son beside her pulling weeds, the mountains visible at the edge of the north pasture in a light that was genuinely unlike any light she'd ever seen before she came here. She probably would not have believed it, not the difficulty of it, and not the specific contentment of it, which were the same thing, she had come to understand. They were not separable. The contentment was not despite the difficulty. It came from the same source. The conversation she had with Arlo in August was not one she had planned or that he had planned, which was probably why it was honest. He found her at the east fence line, the 3rd section, again, always the 3rd section, which she had developed a habit of checking that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the fact that standing there grounded her in some way she didn't try to analyze. She was looking at the repaired posts, which had settled well and held through the spring melt without issue. Arlo came up beside her and looked at the same thing for a while. This was how Arlo arrived at conversations. He'd position himself near the subject and wait, and if you waited back, eventually something got said. 19 years, he said finally. She looked at him. I worked this land for 19 years, he said, for Caleb's father before him. I've seen a lot of things come and go. He looked at the fence posts. I want to say something. All right, she said. When you came. He stopped. He was working through it in his characteristic way, where the pauses were not hesitation, but construction. I didn't know what to think. Caleb sending for someone. I thought, a man his age, set in his ways, bringing in a stranger. I thought it might not go. She waited. I was wrong, he said. It came out without flourish or apology. Just the plain statement of a man who had revised his position and considered the revision important enough to say out loud. Not just about whether it would go, about what you were. He looked at her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? She asked. She was genuinely curious. He seemed to consider this carefully. Someone who needed the ranch, he said. Most people who come to a place like this, they come because they need something from it. You came because... He paused again. Because you had something to offer it. That's different. Most people don't know the difference in themselves. She held that for a moment. The August light came across the north pasture and lit the grass in a way that made it look almost warm to the touch. I needed it too, she said honestly. I needed the ground under my feet. I needed Elliot to have room. She looked at the posts. I wasn't as selfless as that sounds. I didn't say selfless, Arlo said. I said different. Knowing you have something to give and giving it, that's different from just needing to take. He turned to go, because Arlo concluded conversations by leaving them rather than ending them. Then he stopped and looked back. "The boy's going to be good," he said. "He's already good, but he's going to be something." Hanma had a gesture that wasn't quite a word, but she understood it. The kind of something that leaves a mark. "I know," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the barn. She stood at the third section of the east fence for another few minutes, in the August heat, listening to the land. Wade Holloway sold his eastern parcel in September to the cattle buyer from Helena, and the following spring he sold the remainder of his operation and left the valley entirely. Margaret heard this from Ruth in the plain way Ruth delivered things. Wade's gone, sold everything, went to his sister's in Oregon apparently, and felt almost nothing except a mild, distant acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. She had expected to feel more. Satisfaction, maybe? Or the particular vindication of a person who has been underestimated and has outlasted the person who underestimated them. But what she actually felt was closer to indifference, and when she examined that, she found it made sense. Wade Holloway had taken up months of her attention and significant emotional energy, and a January storm's worth of physical risk, but he had never been the point, he had been an obstacle. You didn't mourn obstacles when they cleared, you just moved through the space they'd occupied and kept going. What she felt more strongly, on the morning Ruth told her, was gratitude. Not for Wade's departure specifically, for the fact that the north pasture was full of grass, that the ranch accounts were solid, that Elliot had grown 2 inches since November and was teaching Agnes Sims not just reading, but now also the basics of caring for a young horse, which Agnes had turned out to have an aptitude for that nobody, including Agnes, had suspected. That was what had mattered, not the fight, what the fight had been protecting. Elliot turned 8 that fall, in October, and the birthday was marked by Caleb presenting him with a saddle. Not a child's saddle, a real one, sized for a boy who was growing and would grow into it further, well-made and practical and chosen, with the specific attention Caleb brought to things he considered important. Elliot looked at it for a long moment without speaking, and Margaret watched her son's face do the thing it did when something reached him at the level below words, the level where children live before they learn to translate their interior world into language. "It's for Compass," Elliot said finally. "Not a question." "When she's ready," Caleb said. "She's not quite there yet, but she will be by spring, the way you've been working with her." Elliot ran his hand along the leather. He was being careful about his face, which was also a thing he did when something mattered. "Thank you," he said. "You earned it," Caleb said. "That's different from a gift." Elliot looked up at him. "What's the difference?" "A gift is something you get because someone loves you," Caleb said. "Something you earn is something you get because you did the work. The best things are both at the same time." He looked at the saddle. "That's both." Elliot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad," with the particular inflection of a child who is using a word that still feels slightly new in the mouth and is testing how it fits, "can we go see if Compass will let me put it on her back, just to see?" "She won't," Caleb said. "She's not ready. Can we try anyway?" Caleb looked at him for a moment with an expression Margaret had seen growing over the months. The expression of a man who had not expected to love a child and had found himself doing it without strategy or preparation, found himself ambushed by it in the specific way that the best things ambush you, not all at once but incrementally, until one day you look up and it's simply there, structural, load-bearing, not optional anymore. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go try anyway." She watched them carry the saddle to the barn together, Caleb holding the bulk of the weight, and Elliot holding his end with both hands in complete seriousness. And she thought about the word family, how it was one of those words that meant something different inside the experience of it than it did from the outside. From the outside, it sounded like a category. From the inside, it felt like something you built piece by piece out of mornings and arguments and small repairs and shared meals and the particular knowledge of another person that only comes from being in the same rooms with them through all the different weather. That was what this was. Built, not found, not given. Built. The winter of their first full year as a family was hard. In the way Montana winters were hard. Not catastrophically, not the January siege of the previous year, but steadily and seriously, the kind of cold that required constant attention and left little room for anything that wasn't necessary. The hay held. The herd came through with 2 losses that Caleb recorded in the ledger and did not mention again. The kitchen garden's preserve stores ran lower than Margaret would have liked by February, but held through to the first spring planting. She was pregnant by March. She had suspected it since January and confirmed it by February, and told Caleb on a Tuesday evening with the same directness she brought to everything significant, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where they had spent so many evenings with documents and accounts, and the accumulated business of a life lived together. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was specific, not congratulations, not the performative excitement of a man responding to news he knows he should be excited about. A genuine question about her specific condition, asked because he wanted to know the answer. "I think so," she said honestly. "I'm 36. It's a different thing than 26, but I'm healthy, and I know what I'm doing better than I did the first time." She paused. "I'm not frightened. I don't know I am exactly." "Tell me when you figure it out," he said. "I will." She looked at him. "You?" He thought about it with the honesty she'd come to depend on from him. "Glad," he said finally. "Scared. Both." He looked at the table. "My father wasn't. I don't know if I know how to do this from the start. Elliot was already himself when I met him. A baby is—" He stopped. "A baby is something I don't have experience with." "Neither did I, the first time," she said. "You do the work, and you figure it out." "Is that actually comforting?" "Not really," she admitted. "But it's true." He looked at her with the almost smile. "We'll figure it out," he said. Not as reassurance, as a statement of fact. "We will," she agreed. She told Elliot that evening. He received the news with the same careful deliberation he gave all significant information, processing it quietly while she watched his face. "So I'll have a brother or sister," he said. "Yes." "Will they be annoying?" "Almost certainly," she said. "For a while." He thought about this. "Agnes has a younger brother," he said. "She says he's a lot of work." "That's accurate." Another pause. "Okay," he said. He went back to his book. Then, without looking up, "I'll help." She looked at the top of his dark head and felt, as she sometimes did with Elliot, the specific sensation of loving someone so much it was almost uncomfortable, too large for the chest available. "I know you will," she said. The baby came in October, 2 weeks earlier than expected, in a process that was difficult in the way births are difficult. Not beyond managing, but not gentle either. Not the kind of experience that lets you pretend the body is more reliable than it is. Dr. Sims attended. Caleb sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with the particular controlled stillness of a man maintaining composure through a situation he could not fix or manage or resolve through any action he was capable of taking, which was its own kind of courage. The baby was a girl, small and loud and entirely certain of her own importance from the first moment, which Caleb said was a good sign, and which Elliot observed was probably going to be a problem later, which made Margaret laugh from a position of significant exhaustion in a way that hurt and was worth it. They named her Clara, after a woman who had been a reluctant ally and become a genuine one, which was Margaret's suggestion, and which Caleb accepted without question because he understood the gesture and agreed with the logic. Clara Sims cried when she heard, which was the most emotion Margaret had ever seen from her, and denied it immediately, which was also very Clara Sims. The years that followed were not a montage. They were years, full ones, complicated ones, the kind that don't resolve into clean narratives because life isn't structured that way, and the frontier least of all. There were bad seasons and good ones. A drought in the summer of Elliot's 10th year that tested the ranch's reserves and required decisions that Caleb made with Margaret at his side, going through the numbers with the same focused attention they'd brought to Wade Holloway's legal claim. There was a winter when Clara had a respiratory illness that lasted 6 weeks and frightened them both in the specific way that sick children frighten parents. Not because they don't know how to manage it, but because love makes certainty impossible. There was a season when Arlo's back gave him genuine trouble, and he finally admitted it, and the admitting was its own kind of landmark. There were good seasons. Springs when the calving went smoothly, and the grass came in thick, and the accounts looked the way accounts should look. Summers when Elliot rode Compass across the north pasture with the ease of someone who was entirely at home in his body and his landscape. Evenings when Clara, small and loud and opinionated in a way that was familiar from both sides of her parentage, sat between Elliot and Caleb at the kitchen table, demanding that someone read to her, and Elliot would read with exaggerated patience, and Clara would interrupt every 3 sentences with questions, and Caleb would sit with his almost smile and his coffee, and occasionally answer the questions when Elliot was too frustrated to do it charitably. Margaret sat in those evenings and looked at the room around her and felt the particular quality of a life that had been chosen rather than assigned, the specific weight of it, the texture of having made decisions that cost something and having the results of those decisions visible in the faces around a table. She had made mistakes. She made them throughout those years with the regularity of a person doing difficult things in imperfect conditions. She was too sharp with Caleb sometimes when she was tired, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and they had learned the grammar of apology between them without making it a performance. She was too protective of Elliot in ways that occasionally limited him, and he told her so, with more directness than she always found comfortable, which she had raised him to have and had to live with. She was too slow to ask for help in certain seasons, carrying things alone past the point where sharing them would have been better, which was the oldest of her patterns and the most persistent. None of this unmade what she had built. It was part of it. The imperfection was part of the structure. On a September morning when Elliot was 14, he found her at the east fence line, the third section. She still went there. She had stopped examining why. He came up and stood beside her the way Arlo used to stand beside her. That particular frontier habit of arriving at the edge of something rather than the center of it, making yourself available rather than demanding. He had picked it up from Arlo and from Caleb both, the quality of stillness that wasn't absence. They stood there for a while without talking. "I remember the stagecoach," he said finally. She looked at him. He was almost as tall as Caleb now, which still startled her when she noticed it. His voice had changed over the summer to something that was neither child nor adult and would not be fully resolved for another year or two. "You were 6, she said. "I know how old I was." Not sharp, just the mild precision he'd always had. "I remember that man, on the step." She waited. "I was scared," he said. Not of him specifically. Of the whole thing. Of what it would be. Whether it would be bad. He looked out at the pasture. "I didn't say that." "I know," she said. "I knew anyway." "I figured you did." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something." "Say it." He turned and looked at her directly. The dark eyes that still looked like Robert, and also entirely like himself, the face that had grown into something she couldn't have predicted from the child he'd been. "You made the right choice," he said. "Coming here. I know it was for me, partly, maybe mostly, but I want you to know. It was the right one. Not just for me. For you." She held that. The September light came across the north pasture the way it had the morning she'd stood here with Arlo years ago. "I know," she said. Then because he deserved the honest version, "I didn't always know it. There were months where I was just working and hoping it would become clear. It wasn't always clear." When did it get clear? She thought about it seriously, because he was asking seriously. She thought about the kitchen table and the 1869 letter and Caleb's hands on her face. She thought about January cattle in the dark and Elliot saying okay on the cot in the first weeks when the other children were cruel. She thought about the east fence post and what Caleb had said about it. Helped. "Gradually," she said, and then all at once. Both. He nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected, or at least the one that made sense. "I'm going to stay," he said. "When I'm older. I'm going to work this ranch." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who has decided something at the level below argument, where decisions live before they become plans. "I know you and Dad haven't. I know you didn't ask me to." "No," she said. "I want to. It's mine." He paused. "Ours. But mine too." She looked at her son, this 14-year-old who had been 6 on a stagecoach and frightened in a way he hadn't said, who had learned to ride and mend fence and read weather and care for a young horse and teach an impatient red-haired girl to love books. And she thought about what Arlo had said on an August morning years ago, standing in this same spot. "He's going to be something." "I know," she said. He nodded once, the way Caleb nodded when something was settled. Then he turned back toward the barn. Compass needs her feet looked at, he said, over his shoulder. I was going to do it after breakfast. I'll tell your father, she said. She stood at the east fence for another few minutes after he'd gone, as she usually did. She looked at the post that had been repaired in January 4 years ago and had held through every season since. She looked at the north pasture where the herd was moving slowly in the September morning, unhurried, going about the business of being cattle in good grass. She looked at the mountains at the edge of the horizon, which were the same every morning and also different, which was the thing about mountains. They looked permanent, but the light was always changing on them. Here is what she knew, standing there. She knew that the people who had looked at her on a stagecoach step and decided she was finished, too old and too encumbered, and too much of one thing and not enough of another. They had been measuring the wrong things. They were measuring youth and unattachment and the absence of history. They were measuring her as if the years she'd lived and the choices she'd made and the sun beside her were subtractions. They were not subtractions. They were the whole of her. They were what she'd brought, and the person she'd become in the years since stepping off that stagecoach. The person who could read a fence line and organize a land case and ride into a January storm and raise a son on difficult ground. That person had been made by everything she'd already lived through, not despite it. That was the thing she wanted to be clear about, because it mattered, not just in her story. In the general story of what people do when the world decides they've run out of chances. The world is not reliable at knowing when you've run out of chances. The world goes by visible things, age, situation, the markers that are easiest to count. It misses the interior inventory. It misses what a person has accumulated by the time they arrive at a difficult doorway, the specific knowledge of hardship, the capacity to persist without guarantee, the understanding of what actually matters and what only seems to. It misses the thing that comes from having already survived something. Margaret Whitmore had survived something, more than one something, and she had carried all of it across a continent and walked through a door that opened onto hard work and harder weather, and a man she hadn't known, and a community that hadn't wanted her, and she had stayed and built and fought and stayed again. And she had made something that was real and hers and permanent in the only way that actually counts. Not permanent because it would never change, but permanent because it was built solidly enough to change and hold. She had been 35 on a stagecoach. She would be 40 next spring, and the ranch accounts were solid, and the north pasture was full of grass, and her son was going to stay and work the land beside her, and her daughter was going to grow up with mountains at the edge of her horizon, and Caleb was going to be in the kitchen when she got back, drinking his coffee and checking the weather and being exactly the man she had recognized in 4 letters and confirmed in a decade of difficult seasons. She took one more look at the east fence, the post that held, the ground that had settled, the evidence of something done and survived, and turned toward home. The September light came down across the pasture behind her, warm on her back. She didn't look back at it. She already knew it was there.